I was hanging the star on our Christmas tree when my 7-year-old son burst through the door, his face soaked with tears. "Mom, Aunt Hannah she said I'm a bastard. She said I can't have Christmas candy because I'm not a real Reed." My hands froze. That word bastard, the same word they'd used to destroy me for 30 years. But this time they'd made a fatal mistake. They'd touched my son. For 3 decades I'd stayed silent. I'd let them treat me like dirt, let them call me the family failure, let them erase my identity and steal my inheritance. I'd swallowed every insult, every humiliation, every lie because I thought silence would keep me safe. But the day they hurt Liam, that was the day Megan Reed stopped being a victim. What my sister Hannah didn't know, what my mother Evelyn never suspected, was that I'd been preparing for this war since the day my father died, and left me an envelope containing the truth: I'm not the unwanted charity case. I'm the rightful heir to a $75 million fortune, and the woman who raised me, she murdered my real mother to steal it. I picked up my phone and made one call. 30 minutes later, 10 limousines rolled up to Hannah's mansion. Inside were the lawyers, investigators, and witnesses who would burn the Reed family empire to ash. What happened next forced my sister to her knees, exposed a 28-year-old double murder, and revealed the most shocking family secret in Boston history. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how the most powerful family in Massachusetts fell, and how the woman they called worthless became the one holding the crown. This is the story of how I destroyed them all. And trust me, you won't believe how far I went to make them pay. My name is Megan Reed. I'm 30 years old, a senior solutions architect at a Boston tech consulting firm, and for most of my life I believed I was fundamentally unlovable. That belief was carefully planted, meticulously watered, and ruthlessly maintained by the people who were supposed to love me most, my family. But on this particular December evening, as golden light filtered through the windows of my modest apartment, and soft Christmas music played in the background, I was trying to believe something different. I was trying to believe that love could be real, that family could mean warmth instead of warfare, and that maybe, just maybe, I could give my son the kind of Christmas I never had. The small artificial tree stood in the corner of our living room, waiting to be decorated. It wasn't grand or expensive. I'd bought it on sale 3 years ago at a discount store. But to me, it was more beautiful than any of the professionally decorated 12-foot masterpieces that had filled the Reed family mansion during my childhood. This tree was ours, mine and Liam's, and nobody could take that away from us. "Mom, can I put the angel on top?" Liam asked, his 7-year-old face bright with the kind of pure excitement that still took my breath away. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by boxes of ornaments, his dark hair falling into his eyes the way it always did when he was focused on something important. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, reaching for a delicate glass ball painted with snowflakes. My hands trembled slightly as I hung it on a branch, and I hated that they did. Even here in my own home, in my own safe space, the past had a way of reaching out and reminding me that it wasn't really past at all. It was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to pull me under. The trembling wasn't from cold. Boston winters were brutal, but our apartment was warm and well insulated. No, my hands shook because Christmas had never been a happy time for me. It had been an annual reminder of exactly where I stood in the Reed family hierarchy, which was somewhere below the hired help, and only slightly above the furniture. I could still see it so clearly, me at 8 years old, standing in the corner of the grand living room, while my younger sister Hannah sat surrounded by mountains of wrapped presents. Designer clothes, expensive toys, the latest electronics, nothing was too good for Hannah. The golden child, the perfect daughter, the one who mattered. And there I was, clutching my single gift, which was inevitably something practical and impersonal. Socks or a book I'd never asked for, or once memorably, a set of organizers for a desk I didn't have. The wrapping paper was always recycled from someone else's gift, creased and reused, as if even the act of wrapping something for me wasn't worth the expense of fresh paper. "You're so lucky, Megan," my mother Evelyn would say in front of guests, her smile perfect and cold. Most children would be grateful for what they receive, but I suppose some people are just naturally discontent. And I would stand there small and confused, wondering what I'd done wrong, why I wasn't worthy of the same love Hannah received so effortlessly. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling me back to the present. I glanced at the screen and felt my stomach tighten. A text from Evelyn. Of course. Hannah is hosting Christmas dinner. You may attend if Liam behaves appropriately. I read it 3 times, each time feeling that familiar cocktail of emotions: hurt, anger, resignation, and underneath it all a desperate hope that maybe this year would be different, that maybe this year they'd finally see me as worthy. Even after 30 years, some part of me still wanted their approval. I hated that part of myself. Before I could process the first message, another one came through, this time from Hannah. Please don't bring anything. I've already planned everything perfectly. The subtext was crystal clear. Your contributions aren't wanted. You're allowed to attend, but don't get any ideas about participating. Don't try to be part of this family in any meaningful way. Just show up, sit quietly, and be grateful we're allowing you in the door. I set the phone down carefully, afraid that if I held it any longer, I might throw it across the room. Liam was watching me with those perceptive eyes that missed nothing. Is that Grandma? He asked quietly. Yes, sweetheart. Just making plans for Christmas dinner. I walked to the small calendar hanging on our kitchen wall, the one where I tracked appointments and important dates. December 25th had a star next to it drawn by Liam weeks ago when he'd been excited about Christmas. But as I looked at all those previous years stretching back in my memory like a long, dark hallway, I saw the same pattern repeated endlessly. Every single Christmas marked by the same quiet dread, the same bracing for impact, the same knowledge that I would spend the day being reminded in 1,000 subtle ways that I didn't quite belong. The Reed family Christmas wasn't about togetherness or celebration. It was about maintaining hierarchy, about showing the world and each other exactly where everyone ranked in the family power structure. And I had always been at the bottom. But here in this small apartment with its second-hand furniture and its modest decorations, there was something the Reed mansion had never possessed. There was warmth. Real warmth. The kind that came from actual love instead of performance. The kind that couldn't be bought or staged or photographed for social media. Liam had gone back to sorting ornaments, humming along to the music, completely absorbed in his task. I watched him for a moment, this beautiful child who deserved so much better than what I'd had. He deserved to grow up knowing he was loved unconditionally. He deserved to never stand in a corner, wondering why he wasn't enough. Mom. His voice pulled me from my thoughts. He was holding a small wooden ornament we'd made together at a craft fair last year, his expression thoughtful. Why doesn't Aunt Hannah ever invite me to help decorate her house? She always posts those pictures on Instagram with all the fancy decorations, but we're never there when she's putting them up. The question hit me like a physical blow. My 7-year-old son had noticed. Of course he had. Children always notice when they're being excluded, even when the adults pretend everything is fine. I knelt down beside him, taking his small hands in mine. For a moment, I considered lying, telling him something easy and comfortable that would make the hurt go away. But I'd spent my whole life swimming in lies, and I'd promised myself I would never do that to Liam. Because some people are afraid of seeing others happy, sweetheart, I said gently, brushing his dark hair back from his forehead. They think happiness is something you have to take from someone else, not something you can create together. They don't understand that there's enough love and joy for everyone. He looked at me with those wise eyes, processing this in the way children do, not understanding all the complexity, but grasping the essential truth underneath. That's sad, he said simply. Yes, I agreed, pulling him into a hug. It is sad. As I held him, feeling his small heartbeat against my chest, something shifted inside me. A resolution forming hard and clear as crystal. I had spent 30 years accepting their cruelty, their dismissal, their systematic erasure of my worth. I'd told myself it was easier to stay quiet, to not make waves, to protect myself by expecting nothing. But I couldn't do that anymore. Not when it affected Liam. Not when I could see the same pattern beginning to repeat itself in the next generation. They wanted to make him feel the way they'd made me feel, unwanted, less than fundamentally flawed. And I would burn the whole world down before I let that happen. I looked at our little Christmas tree, its lights twinkling in the growing darkness, and something fierce and powerful rose up in my chest. This year would be different. It had to be. I whispered to myself so quietly that Liam couldn't hear. This year, everything will be different. I had no idea how prophetic those words would turn out to be. The next morning, I woke up with that whispered promise still echoing in my mind. This year would be different. But as I poured cereal for Liam and watched him eat his breakfast with the unself-conscious contentment of childhood, I realized that making things different would require more than just determination. It would require giving him something I'd never had: the truth about what family really means or doesn't mean. "Liam," I said, sitting down across from him at our small kitchen table, "I want to talk to you about something important." He looked up from his bowl milk dripping from his spoon, his expression open and trusting in a way that made my heart ache. How much longer would he look at the world like that before people like Evelyn and Hannah taught him to be guarded and afraid? "You know how we talk about family being the people who love you," I began carefully. "Well, sweetheart, I need you to understand something. Family doesn't always mean love. Sometimes people keep you close, not because they care about you, but because they want to control who you become. They want to decide if you're allowed to be happy, if you're allowed to succeed, if you're allowed to feel good about yourself." Liam tilted his head, his young face serious as he tried to process what I was telling him. "Like Aunt Hannah?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. The question shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. At 7 years old, he'd already noticed what I'd tried so hard to hide from him: the coldness, the exclusion, the subtle cruelty that the Reed family specialized in. I chose my next words with the precision of someone defusing a bomb. "Like many people, honey, some families love you for who you are. They want you to grow and be yourself and find your own happiness. But other families—" I paused, searching for age-appropriate language for a concept that had taken me decades to understand. "Other families love the power they can take from you, the ability to make you feel small so they can feel big. They're afraid of you being strong and happy because then they can't control you anymore." It was a cynical lesson to teach a 7-year-old, I knew that. Most parents protected their children from these truths, let them believe in the fairy tale of unconditional family love for as long as possible. But I'd learned the hard way that ignorance wasn't protection, it was just another way to be vulnerable. I wanted Liam to understand that love was a choice, an action, a deliberate kindness, not an automatic result of sharing blood or a last name. "That's mean," Liam said, finally, his small face troubled. "Yes," I agreed. "It is mean, and it's important that you know it's not your fault when people are mean to you. It's about them, not about you." As I watched him return to his cereal, still processing this new understanding of the world, my mind drifted back to the moment when I'd learned this lesson myself. My 10th birthday. God, I could still feel it like it was yesterday, the way humiliation burns itself into your nervous system and never quite fades. They'd thrown me a party, or at least that's what they called it. Looking back now with adult eyes, I understood it had been something else entirely. It had been a performance, a demonstration of hierarchy, a way of showing everyone in the Reed social circle exactly where I stood in the family structure. I'd worn a dress from a discount store, something my mother had picked out without asking my opinion. It was the wrong size, the wrong color, the wrong everything. Meanwhile, Hannah, who was only 8 at the time, wore a designer dress that probably cost more than our monthly grocery budget. She looked like a little princess. I looked like exactly what I was: an afterthought barely worth the effort of proper presentation. The living room of the Reed mansion had been full of their wealthy friends and business associates, people who'd known our family for generations. Evelyn had moved through the crowd like a queen, Hannah at her side, introducing her daughter with obvious pride and love. "This is Hannah, our absolute pride and joy. So talented, so beautiful, destined for greatness. We're so blessed to have her." The guests had cooed and smiled, complimenting Hannah's dress, her manners, her everything. And then Evelyn's eyes had found me standing awkwardly near the dessert table, trying to make myself invisible. "And this is Megan," she'd said, her voice shifting to something cooler, more distant. "She's well, she tries her best." The pause before those last 3 words had been deliberate, calculated to make everyone in the room understand that my best wasn't very good. That I was a disappointment, a burden, someone to be tolerated rather than celebrated. The polite laughter that followed, uncomfortable, pitying knowing, had felt like being flayed alive in public. I'd stood there 10 years old and already learning to hate myself, wondering what was wrong with me that my own mother couldn't love me, wondering what I could do, what I could change, what I could become that would finally make me worthy of the affection Hannah received so effortlessly. For years, too many years, I'd believed the problem was me, that I genuinely was inferior, fundamentally flawed, less deserving of love and kindness. It wasn't until my late 20s, after countless therapy sessions and a lot of hard internal work, that I'd realized the truth. The cruelty was systematic. It was deliberate. It was strategic. Evelyn didn't treat me that way because I deserved it. She treated me that way because she needed me to feel worthless. But why? That was the question that haunted me, still the puzzle piece that didn't fit. Why did Evelyn need to keep me suppressed? Why did my potential independence terrify her so much? When I was younger, I'd thought maybe it was my personality. Maybe I was too loud, too clumsy, too different from what the Reed family wanted. But as I'd gotten older and become successful in my career, the coldness from Evelyn had only intensified. When I'd mentioned my promotion to senior architect 3 years ago, she'd responded with, "How nice, dear. Everyone gets participation trophies these days." When I'd bought this apartment with my own money, she'd said, "Well, I suppose it's cozy enough for your situation." The better I did, the more threatened she seemed. And that made no sense. Wouldn't a mother be proud of her daughter's accomplishments? Wouldn't she want to see her succeed? Unless I wasn't really her daughter. Unless there was something about me, some truth about my existence that threatened her in ways I didn't understand. Mark had known something. In his final months before the pancreatic cancer took him, he'd tried multiple times to speak to me privately. But Evelyn had always been there, interrupting, redirecting, ensuring we were never alone together. And then he'd died, taking his secrets with him. Or so I'd thought. The doorbell rang, interrupting my spiraling thoughts. Liam jumped up to answer it, but I caught his arm gently. "Let me get it, sweetheart." Through the peephole, I saw a FedEx delivery person holding a package. I signed for it, closed the door, and looked at the label. The return address was a law firm I didn't recognize. Thomas Brennan, attorney at law. Inside was an envelope with official letterhead and a brief note typed on expensive paper. "Dear Ms. Reed, your late father, Mark Reed, instructed me to deliver this envelope to you exactly 3 months after his passing. Per his wishes, I am doing so now." My hands shook as I opened the inner envelope. Inside were documents, photographs, and a handwritten letter in Mark's familiar script. The first line stopped my heart. "Megan, if you're reading this, I'm gone and I can finally tell you the truth. You are not my daughter. You are my niece. Your mother was my sister Sarah, and Evelyn killed her." I stood frozen in my kitchen, Mark's letter trembling in my hands, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. "You are not my daughter. You are my niece. Your mother was my sister Sarah, and Evelyn killed her." The room tilted, the floor seeming to shift beneath my feet. Everything I thought I knew about my identity, my family, my entire existence had just shattered into 1,000 pieces. But before I could process this nuclear revelation, before I could even begin to understand what it meant, I needed to understand the system that had kept this secret buried for 3 decades. I needed to understand how the Reed family machine operated, because only then could I figure out how to dismantle it. Hannah was the key to understanding how Evelyn wielded power. My sister, or rather my cousin though, I still couldn't quite wrap my mind around that had been manufactured from birth to be the perfect Reed heir. I'd watched it happen in real time, though I'd never fully understood what I was witnessing. From the moment Hannah entered the world in 1992, her life had been a performance. Evelyn literally issued a press release announcing her birth, complete with professional photographs and statements about the next generation of Reed excellence. While most babies got simple birth announcements sent to friends and family, Hannah got a media campaign. Every aspect of her life had been curated with surgical precision. The Montessori preschool that cost more than some people's yearly salary. The private elementary school where children of senators and CEOs learned together. The etiquette classes starting at age 5 teaching her which fork to use and how to make small talk with philanthropists. By the time Hannah was a teenager, she had an internship lined up at a Fortune 500 company, not because she'd applied or earned it, but because Evelyn had called in favors and arranged it years in advance. Her Instagram feed, which had tens of thousands of followers, looked like something from a lifestyle magazine. Elegant dinner parties where every table setting was perfect. Charity galas where she wore designer gowns and smiled for cameras. Luxury vacations to European cities always photographed in golden hour lighting that made everything look magical. But I'd seen Hannah when the cameras were off. I'd seen the emptiness behind her eyes, the way she seemed to be constantly performing, even when no one was watching, as if she'd forgotten how to just exist without an audience. She'd never been allowed to fail at anything, never permitted to try something just for fun without it being part of her personal brand development. Evelyn had molded her into the ideal daughter, but in the process had stripped away any possibility of Hannah discovering who she actually was beneath all that programming. The strangest part was how Hannah seemed to feel about me. It wasn't simple hatred, though, that would have been easier to understand. It was something more complicated, more twisted. I'd caught her looking at me sometimes with an expression I couldn't quite decode, resentment mixed with something that might have been envy. Once when we were in our 20s, and she'd had too much wine at a family dinner, she'd said something I'd never forgotten. "You're so lucky, Megan. You get to fail. You get to be mediocre, and nobody cares. Do you know what that's like to have the freedom to just be ordinary?" At the time, I'd thought she was being cruel, rubbing in my perceived inadequacy. But now, holding Mark's letter, I wondered if she'd been expressing a genuine longing. Hannah was trapped in a gilded cage, performing a role she'd never chosen, while I, cast out and dismissed, had accidentally gained the one thing she desperately wanted: the freedom to be myself. That freedom had come at a terrible price, of course. The price was being systematically degraded and controlled by the two people who ran the Reed family like a corporation. Evelyn and Mark hadn't been parents in any meaningful sense. They'd been managers treating their children like human assets to be optimized for maximum return on investment. Evelyn had been the primary architect of this system, but Mark had enabled it through his silence. He'd stood by while Evelyn humiliated me at every opportunity. He'd watched her control every breath Hannah took. He'd participated in the fiction that this was normal, that this was what family looked like. Love in the Reed household had functioned like a performance bonus. Something you received when you met certain metrics, when you played your assigned role correctly. Deviation from the script was punished with coldness, exclusion, and public humiliation. But in his final months, something had changed in Mark. The cancer that was eating through his body seemed to have also eaten through whatever barrier had kept him silent for so long. He'd tried to talk to me privately 6 times, pulling me aside at hospital visits, asking me to come by the house when Evelyn wasn't there. But she'd always appeared, always interrupted, always ensured we were never alone together long enough for him to tell me whatever secret was burning him alive from the inside. In his last week, Mark had insisted on meeting with his attorney privately. Evelyn had been furious, standing outside the hospital room door demanding to know what they were discussing. The attorney, Thomas Brennan, had been professional and firm attorney-client privilege, Mrs. Reed. "You'll have to discuss it with your husband directly." But Mark had never gotten the chance to discuss it with anyone. He'd died 2 days later, taking what I'd assumed were his secrets to the grave. Except he'd left this letter, these documents, this ticking time bomb set to detonate exactly 3 months after his death. Since Mark died, Evelyn had become even more controlling, more desperate to maintain her iron grip on the family narrative. I could see it in the way she'd started pushing harder to marginalize me completely, to ensure Hannah inherited everything, to finalize my permanent exclusion from whatever the Reed legacy actually meant. What Evelyn didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd built something entirely separate from their world. While they'd been busy treating me like the family failure, I'd been quietly becoming exactly the kind of success they claimed to value. I'd started as a junior developer at a small tech firm right out of college, working twice as hard as everyone else to prove I belonged there. Over the years, I'd moved up steadily, mid-level developer, team lead, senior architect. Now I was pulling in $135,000 a year at a respected Boston consulting firm. I had a retirement account, a diversified investment portfolio worth over $200,000, and a savings plan for Liam's education that would ensure he never had to beg the Reeds for anything. But I'd learned early to keep this success invisible to them. The one time I'd made the mistake of mentioning a promotion, I must have been 25, still naive enough to hope for approval. Evelyn had dismissed it with that cutting line about participation trophies, and Hannah had spent the rest of the evening making jokes about Megan's little computer job to their wealthy friends. So I'd gone underground. Let them think I was barely scraping by. Let them believe their narrative about me being incompetent and struggling. It was safer that way. It protected Liam from their scrutiny and kept me off their radar as any kind of threat. But holding Mark's letter, reading about Sarah and murder and secrets buried for 30 years, I wondered if playing invisible had been a strategic error. Maybe silence and hiding had never been protection at all. Maybe they'd just been another form of surrender. My phone rang, jarring me out of my thoughts. The caller ID showed Evelyn's name, and my stomach clenched with instinctive dread. I answered. "Hello? Megan, darling." Her voice was like ice over steel, sharp enough to cut. "I need you to understand something. Whatever Mark may have written to you before he died, it was morphine-induced confusion. The man was heavily medicated and not in his right mind. Don't do anything that would embarrass Hannah this Christmas. Are we clear?" The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me standing in my kitchen holding a phone in one hand and the truth about my mother's murder in the other. I stood there for a long moment after Evelyn hung up my phone, still pressed to my ear, even though the line was dead. Her threat had been crystal clear, even though she'd wrapped it in that deceptively gentle tone she used when she was at her most dangerous. Whatever Mark wrote was morphine confusion. Don't embarrass Hannah. Are we clear? But it wasn't clear at all. Because Mark's letter wasn't confused. Rambling, it was detailed, specific, and it named my mother. Sarah. A woman I'd never heard of, never been told about, whose existence had been systematically erased from my life. And Evelyn's immediate call within hours of that package being delivered told me she knew exactly what Mark had written. She was terrified of what I might do with that information. I forced myself to put the phone down and focus on what was in front of me. I'd read the full letter later when Liam was asleep, and I could process it without him seeing me fall apart. For now, I needed to maintain normalcy to give him the peaceful Christmas preparation I'd promised him. I'd sent Liam to a friend's house that afternoon for a play date, giving myself time to deal with the package. Now I needed to finish decorating our tree before he came home to preserve this small island of warmth and safety we'd created together. I climbed back up the stepladder, reaching for the star we'd bought together last year. It was nothing fancy, just a simple gold star from the craft store, but Liam had picked it out with such careful consideration, weighing it against 3 other options before declaring this one the most magical. I was stretching up to place it on the highest branch when I heard the front door slam open with such force that the entire apartment seemed to shake. My heart jumped into my throat. That wasn't the sound of Liam coming home happy from a play date. That was the sound of something wrong, something terrible. I nearly fell off the ladder in my rush to get down, abandoning the star, and nearly twisting my ankle as I jumped the last 2 feet to the floor. Liam burst into the living room, and the sight of him stopped my heart. His small face was completely drained of color, white as paper, making the red of his eyes even more vivid. His hands were shaking so violently he couldn't seem to control them. Tears streamed down his cheeks in steady rivers, and his breath came in sharp, panicked gasps that sounded like he was drowning. Liam. I dropped to my knees on the floor, reaching for him. Baby, what happened? He couldn't answer at first. His whole body was shaking, radiating a kind of trauma that I'd only seen in adults, never in children. Never in my child. I pulled him into my arms and he collapsed against me, his small frame racked with sobs so intense they seemed to be tearing him apart from the inside. Sweetheart, you have to tell me what happened, I said, trying to keep my voice calm even though panic was clawing at my throat. Are you hurt? Did someone hurt you? He shook his head against my chest, still unable to form words. I held him tighter, one hand cradling his head, the other rubbing circles on his back, the way I'd done since he was a baby. Slowly, his breathing began to even out, enough for him to speak. Aunt Hannah, he managed between hiccuping sobs. She said I'm bad. She said I can't have the Christmas candy. She said... His voice broke again and he buried his face in my shoulder. My blood was already running cold. I knew. Somehow I already knew what was coming. What did she say, baby? Tell Mommy. She said a word, Liam whispered against my neck, his voice so small I could barely hear it. I don't know what it means. She said... He pulled back to look at me, his eyes full of confusion and shame and hurt. Bastard? What does that mean, Mom? Am I bad? Am I wrong? The word hit me like a physical blow, punching the air from my lungs. Bastard. That word. That fucking word that had poisoned my entire childhood, that had made me feel like a mistake, like something shameful that should be hidden away. The memories erupted in my mind like a dam breaking. I was 12 years old again, hiding behind a door at one of Evelyn's cocktail parties, hearing her voice drift into the hallway. Megan. Oh, she's not really ours. A bastard child Mark felt morally obligated to take in after a... situation. We do our Christian duty, you understand. The laughter that followed, the knowing looks, the way people had stared at me differently after that, like I was contaminated. I remembered being 14 and overhearing Evelyn on the phone with someone saying, "Well, what did you expect? She's a bastard. They always have problems." I'd looked up the word in the dictionary, read the clinical definition. A child born to unmarried parents, and understood for the first time why I was treated like I was fundamentally defective. I'd spent years in therapy, thousands of dollars, and countless hours trying to rebuild a sense of self-worth after being labeled that way for so long. Learning that being born didn't make you shameful, that circumstances of your birth didn't determine your value, that you could be wanted and loved even if the people raising you didn't want or love you. And now Hannah had taken that same weapon, that same poison, and used it on my 7-year-old son. The cycle was repeating. 30 years later, and they were doing to Liam exactly what they'd done to me. They were teaching him to hate himself, to feel ashamed of his existence, to believe he was fundamentally flawed and unworthy of basic human kindness. If I didn't stop this now, Liam would grow up the way I had, spending decades trying to convince himself he deserved to exist, carrying the weight of their cruelty like stones in his chest, always wondering what was wrong with him that his own family couldn't love him. No, absolutely not. I would burn the entire Reed empire to the ground before I let that happen to my son. The cozy apartment that had felt like such a sanctuary just an hour ago now felt like a war room. Everything seemed sharper, clearer, more focused. The soft Christmas lights looked harsh. The gentle music playing in the background sounded discordant. The world had shifted on its axis, and I had shifted with it. I held Liam close, feeling his heart beating against mine, feeling the tremors still running through his small body. My own heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces for him. But underneath that pain, something else was rising. Something cold and hard and absolutely implacable. For 30 years, I'd absorbed their abuse. I'd told myself it was the price of maintaining some connection to family. I'd convinced myself that staying quiet, keeping my head down, not making waves was the smart strategy. That silence would protect me and eventually maybe earn me some small measure of acceptance. That strategy had failed spectacularly. Silence hadn't protected me, it had just made me an easier target. And now they'd moved on to the next generation, to my innocent child who'd done nothing except exist. They'd crossed a line, the ultimate line. They'd hurt my baby, and for that there would be consequences they couldn't imagine. I pulled back slightly, looking into Liam's tear-stained face, his eyes still wide with confusion and hurt. I wiped his tears gently with my thumbs and spoke with a calm that surprised even me. There was no rage in my voice, no hysteria, no emotion at all, just absolute certainty. They hurt you. They made you feel small. That was their mistake, Liam. Their last mistake. Now they're going to face me, and I won't be the scared little girl they remember. Liam looked at me with those perceptive eyes that saw everything. What are you going to do, Mom? I smoothed his hair back from his forehead, my mind already working, already planning, already seeing the path forward with perfect clarity. I'm going to make sure they never hurt you again, I said quietly. Sweetheart, can you hand Mommy her phone? There's someone I need to call. After I got Liam settled on the couch with his favorite blanket and a cup of hot chocolate, I sat down across from him with my phone in my hands. My fingers hovered over the screen, but I couldn't seem to make them move. Part of my brain was screaming at me to act, to do something to make this right immediately. But another part, the part that had been trained through 30 years of conditioning, was whispering doubt. Was I overreacting? The question slithered through my mind like poison. Maybe Hannah hadn't meant it the way it sounded. Maybe it had been a momentary lapse in judgment, words said in frustration that came out harsher than intended. Maybe she didn't fully understand how devastating that word would be to a 7-year-old child. Maybe Liam had misunderstood the context, heard things in a way that made them sound worse than they actually were. I looked at my son, curled up on the couch with his arms wrapped around his knees, his eyes still red and swollen from crying. He was staring at nothing. His small face carrying an expression no child should ever have, shame mixed with confusion. The look of someone who's been told they're fundamentally wrong, but doesn't understand why. The doubt evaporated like steam. Hannah had meant every syllable. I knew it with the kind of certainty that comes from 3 decades of studying predators. I'd spent my entire life learning to read the Reed family's behavioral patterns, to anticipate their attacks, to understand the psychology behind their cruelty. They didn't lash out randomly. They weaponized language with surgical precision, choosing words designed to inflict maximum psychological damage while maintaining plausible deniability. Hannah didn't make careless mistakes with words. She was Evelyn's protege, trained since birth in the art of social manipulation. Every Instagram caption was crafted for effect. Every public statement was focus grouped. Every conversation was a chess game where she planned 3 moves ahead. Calling Liam a bastard wasn't spontaneous cruelty born of momentary frustration. It was strategic. It was calculated. It was the opening move in a multi-decade campaign to ensure he never challenged her position in the family hierarchy. Because that's what this was really about, wasn't it? Not some petty spite against a 7-year-old child. This was about inheritance, about power, about ensuring that Liam grew up believing he was illegitimate and had no claim to anything the Reed family possessed. If she could plant that seed of self-doubt early enough, water it with consistent cruelty, he would internalize it. He would accept his place at the bottom of the hierarchy without ever questioning whether he deserved better. Just like I had for 30 years. I thought about all those years of silence. Every time Evelyn had made a cutting remark and I'd smiled and changed the subject. Every time Hannah had excluded me from family events and I'd pretended it didn't hurt. Every insult I'd swallowed, every humiliation I'd endured, every door slammed in my face that I'd simply walked away from. I'd told myself it was the smart strategy. Stay quiet. Don't make waves. accept the crumbs they offer, and be grateful for them. Eventually, if I was good enough, compliant enough, invisible enough, maybe they would accept me. Maybe they would love me. But what had that silence actually bought me? I cataloged the returns on my investment of 3 decades of submission. It hadn't protected me from escalating abuse. If anything, it had invited more. It hadn't earned their respect. They still treated me like an embarrassing charity case. It hadn't softened their treatment. Evelyn's cruelty had only grown more refined over the years, more subtle, and therefore more devastating. All my silence had done was establish me as an acceptable target. Someone who would absorb infinite cruelty without consequence. Someone whose boundaries could be violated without fear of retaliation. Someone who could be safely used as a scapegoat for whatever dysfunction the family needed to discharge. The Reed family system required someone at the bottom. There had to be a person everyone could look down on, someone whose failures made everyone else feel successful by comparison, someone whose presence allowed them to feel superior and therefore secure in their own positions. For 30 years I had filled that role, and now they wanted to transfer it to Liam. If I stayed silent now, if I didn't fight back, they would succeed. They would do to him exactly what they'd done to me. They would spend the next 30 years systematically destroying his self-worth, teaching him he was fundamentally flawed, ensuring he never believed he deserved love or success or basic human dignity. I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Jennifer Walsh. She'd been my attorney for the past 5 years, handling employment contract negotiations and the legal work when I bought this apartment. She was sharp, ethical, and most importantly, she had no connection to the Reed family's network of influence. She answered on the second ring. "Megan, everything okay?" "No," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I need legal advice. My sister verbally abused my 7-year-old son today. She called him a bastard and told him he wasn't entitled to participate in family activities because of his illegitimate status." There was a pause. When Jennifer spoke again, her lawyer voice was fully engaged. "Tell me everything. Details matter." I laid it out with clinical precision, keeping my emotions locked down, focusing on facts. The incident today, the pattern of exclusion over the past year, the family dynamics that made this not a one-time occurrence, but the opening move in a long-term pattern of abuse. Jennifer listened without interrupting, and I could hear her typing notes. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Okay," she said finally. "If you can document this audio recording's video evidence, credible witness testimony, you could potentially build a case for harassment. More importantly, we create a legal record. That record becomes crucial if they ever try to challenge your custody or if there are inheritance disputes down the line. We establish that you're the protective parent, and they're the ones creating a hostile environment for a minor child." She paused, and I could hear the shift in her tone from lawyer to friend. "But Megan, you need to understand what you're starting here. The Reed family has serious resources. Political connections, social influence, money for the best lawyers in the state. If you declare war on them, they will fight back with everything they have. Legal warfare, reputation, destruction, social isolation. They'll use every weapon in their arsenal. Are you prepared for that level of conflict? Are you ready for what this is going to cost you?" I looked at Liam again. He'd fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from crying, his face still showing the tracks of his tears. In sleep, he looked even younger than 7, vulnerable and innocent and deserving of protection. "Let them fight," I said, and I heard the steel in my own voice. "I'm done being afraid. They hurt my child, Jennifer. That's not something I can let slide. That's not something I can be strategic about or diplomatic about. They crossed a line and now they're going to face consequences." "All right," Jennifer said, and I could hear approval in her voice. "Then let's prepare for war. I'll start drafting documentation requests and researching precedents. In the meantime, document everything. Every interaction, every text message, every incident. Build the case." We talked for another 15 minutes about logistics and strategy, but my mind was already made. The debate was over. The decision was final. When I hung up, I sat there in the quiet apartment watching my son sleep, and I whispered to myself like a vow, like a promise to the universe that I intended to keep no matter what it cost me. No tear my son cries will go unanswered. Not one. The vow I'd made wasn't born of impulse. That was important to understand. I wasn't acting out of blind rage or maternal hysteria. I'd been preparing for this confrontation for 3 months, ever since Mark's death. Ever since I'd started noticing the patterns that suggested something was building beneath the surface. During Mark's final weeks in the hospital, when he'd kept trying to pull me aside for private conversations, and Evelyn kept intercepting, I'd understood on some instinctive level that he was trying to warn me about something. The desperation in his eyes when she'd appear in the doorway cutting off whatever he'd been about to say. The way he'd insisted on that private meeting with his attorney, refusing to let Evelyn be present even though she'd demanded it. The careful way he'd looked at me during his last conscious moments as if trying to communicate something crucial he didn't have the strength to say aloud. I'd known then that a storm was coming. I just hadn't known what form it would take. So I'd started preparing, quietly, methodically, in ways that wouldn't attract attention. I'd opened a private journal not on my laptop where it could potentially be hacked, but an actual physical notebook that I kept locked in a drawer. In it, I'd documented 30 years of mistreatment, not with emotion or drama, but with dates, times, witnesses present, exact quotes when I could remember them. Every dismissive comment Evelyn had made about my parenting. Every time Hannah had excluded Liam from family events. Every instance of them rewriting history to make me seem unstable or incompetent. I'd researched family law attorneys, carefully vetting ones who had no connection to the Reed family's extensive network. I'd read case law about emotional abuse of children, about grandparents' rights and custody disputes, about inheritance challenges and family trusts. I'd educated myself on the legal landscape I might need to navigate, and I'd quietly reached out to establish relationships with legal resources, scheduling initial consultations, building rapport, making sure I had a team I could activate when the time came. That time was now. Within 2 hours of making my vow, I had 4 attorneys committed to my case. Not an army, because I didn't need overwhelming numbers. I needed surgical precision. Jennifer Walsh was handling the family law and potential custody issues. David Chen specialized in inheritance disputes and estate law. Maria Rodriguez focused on child protection and psychological abuse cases. And Thomas Brennan, Mark's attorney who'd delivered the envelope, had agreed to serve as a consultant given his knowledge of the Reed family's legal structure. I also contacted 2 journalists I'd researched, both of whom covered family court cases for Boston publications. I wasn't trying to create a media circus or publicly humiliate anyone, but I needed independent documentation witnesses outside the family's sphere of influence who could verify what was happening. If this went the direction I suspected it would, having credible third-party observers would be crucial. Everything was strategic. Everything was measured. Everything was designed to protect Liam while forcing the Reed family into accountability they'd avoided for decades. Once my team was in place, I sat down at my laptop and composed the email that would change everything. I wrote and rewrote it 5 times, removing any hint of emotion, any language that could be characterized as aggressive or unstable. This needed to be professional, calm, and absolutely clear. The final version read, "Dear Mother and Hannah, I will be attending the Christmas dinner at Hannah's home as previously discussed. I will be accompanied by my son Liam and my legal counsel. We look forward to a family gathering where all members, regardless of their position in the family structure, are treated with basic human dignity and respect. If that standard cannot be met, I have prepared alternative legal remedies to ensure my son's psychological and emotional well-being is protected. I trust this won't be necessary. Warmly, Megan." I copied all 4 attorneys on the email before I could second-guess myself. Then I hit send. The response was immediate, though not from Evelyn or Hannah directly. Within an hour, my phone started buzzing with texts from distant relatives and family friends I hadn't heard from in years. Is everything okay? What's going on with you and Hannah? Your mother is very upset. The Reed family social circle was small and tightly networked. News traveled fast, especially scandalous news. I could imagine the conversations happening right now in expensive homes across Boston. Megan Reed, the quiet one who'd never caused trouble, who'd accepted her place at the family's margins for 3 decades, was suddenly pushing back. With lawyers. With formal language about legal remedies and emotional well-being. Who was she really? What had she been hiding all these years? Let them wonder. Let them talk. For the first time in my life, I didn't care what the Reed social circle thought of me. That evening, after Liam had recovered somewhat from the trauma of the afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I dressed him in his best outfit, not the one I saved for Reed family events, where we needed to look presentable, but not too impressive. His actual best outfit, the one I'd bought him for his school's awards ceremony, where he'd won the Kindness Award. He looked at himself in the mirror, confused. "Are we going somewhere, Mom?" "No, sweetheart, but I need to talk to you about something important, and I want you to see yourself the way I see you. Strong, valuable, worth dressing up for." We sat together on the couch and I took his hands in mine. "Liam, you know how Aunt Hannah said something mean to you today?" He nodded, his eyes dropping. "I need you to understand something. Some people in our family don't always treat others kindly. They say hurtful things and make others feel small because it makes them feel powerful. But starting today, we're not going to accept that anymore. We're going to stand up for ourselves." "How?" he asked, his voice small but curious. "By remembering who we are. By knowing our worth. By refusing to let anyone make us feel ashamed of existing." I squeezed his hands gently. "You are not bad, Liam. You are not a mistake. You are loved, wanted, and valuable exactly as you are. And anyone who tells you differently is wrong. Not just a little wrong, completely fundamentally wrong." He looked at me with those wise eyes, processing this. "Are you going to fight with Aunt Hannah?" "I'm going to make sure she understands that hurting you has consequences," I said carefully. "Not because I'm mean, but because protecting you is my job. And I'm very good at my job." A small smile tugged at his lips. "You're the best mom." Something in my chest cracked open, warm and painful and right. This wasn't just about revenge or justice, I realized. This was about breaking a generational curse. About teaching my son something I'd had to learn at 30 years old, that dignity was worth fighting for, that abuse didn't have to be accepted, that silence in the face of cruelty wasn't a virtue, but a surrender. I was teaching him that he deserved to be protected, to be valued, to be treated with basic human respect. And I was teaching him through action, not just words. He was watching me transform from victim to warrior, from someone who absorbed abuse to someone who fought back. This was the moment where everything changed, where survival became resistance, where the scared little girl I'd been for 30 years finally permanently died. My phone buzzed. A text from Hannah. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Megan. You have no idea what you've started." I read it twice, then showed it to Jennifer Walsh, who told me to save it as evidence. Then I looked at Liam sleeping peacefully now in his best clothes, finally relaxed after the trauma of the day. I texted back, "You're right, Hannah. I know exactly what I've started, and I know exactly how it's going to end." I thought I was ready for their response. I'd prepared for legal maneuvers, for public denials, for aggressive counterattacks. What I hadn't prepared for was Evelyn's most devastating weapon, the appearance of vulnerability. She called the next morning while I was making breakfast for Liam. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the lawyer in me wanting to document whatever threats she was about to make. But when she spoke, her voice wasn't the ice over steel I'd expected. It was soft, almost fragile, carrying a weight of sadness that sounded disturbingly genuine. "Megan, sweetheart," she began, and the endearment alone made me grip the phone harder. She never called me sweetheart. I think you and I need to have an honest conversation. Just the two of us. Mother to daughter. I stayed silent, waiting for the trap I knew was coming. Do you know why I've never been able to show you the warmth I show Hannah? She paused, and I heard what sounded like a shaky breath. It's because every time I look at you, I see someone I lost. Someone who was taken from me. You look so much like her, Megan. The resemblance is haunting, actually. It breaks my heart every single day. My mind raced. Someone I lost. Someone she saw in me. Was she talking about Sarah Mark's letter had said Sarah was my mother, Evelyn had killed her. But the way Evelyn was speaking now with what sounded like genuine grief was this an admission, a manipulation. Both. I don't understand what you're talking about, I said carefully. I know you don't. Another pause, another breath that trembled just slightly. And maybe that's my fault. Maybe I've kept too many secrets for too long. But please, Megan, please don't bring lawyers to Christmas dinner. Let's handle this as a family, for Liam's sake. He doesn't need to be caught in the middle of adult conflicts. He deserves better than that. The request sounded so reasonable, so caring, so much like what an actual concerned grandmother would say. And that's what made it terrifying, because I couldn't tell if it was genuine or the most sophisticated manipulation I'd ever encountered. Hannah hurt him, I said, keeping my voice level. She used a word designed to make him feel ashamed of existing. That's not something I can just overlook for the sake of family harmony. I know, Evelyn said, and she actually sounded regretful. Hannah can be thoughtless sometimes. She doesn't always understand how her words impact others. I'll speak to her, I promise. But lawyers, Megan, legal threats. That's not how family handles things. That's how enemies handle things. And we're not enemies, are we? The conversation ended shortly after with me making no commitments, but feeling strangely unbalanced. Had Evelyn just shown me a glimpse of something real? Or had she simply found a new way to throw me off guard before the real attack began? I got my answer that afternoon when I checked social media and saw Hannah's Instagram stories. She'd posted a series of perfectly curated images of herself decorating her home for Christmas. Elegant garlands, designer ornaments, everything positioned for maximum aesthetic impact. But it was the captions that made my stomach turn. Getting ready for our Reed family Christmas celebration, can't wait to see everyone and celebrate the love that binds us together even through challenging times. The next story showed her holding a framed photograph I recognized Megan and Hannah as children, maybe 5 and 3 years old, arms around each other, smiling. I'd never seen this photo before. She must have gone through old family albums specifically to find it. Sisters forever through all of life's misunderstandings. Family means loving each other even when we disagree. So grateful for the bonds that can't be broken. The comments were already rolling in. Hundreds of them. You're such a good sister. This is so beautiful. Family is everything. Your heart is so pure. Hannah sighed. She was rewriting the narrative in real time, positioning herself as the loving, forgiving sister trying to maintain family unity while I was the unstable one creating unnecessary drama. And it was working. My phone started buzzing with messages from distant relatives, old family friends, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Hannah's post is so sweet. Is everything okay between you two? Your sister seems really worried about you. Maybe you should reach out. Family is so important, Megan. Whatever's going on, I hope you can work it out. They had no idea what Hannah had said to Liam. They had no context for why I was taking legal action. All they saw was Hannah's carefully constructed image of herself as the peacemaker and me as the problem. The third strike came via certified mail. A formal cease and desist letter from Mitchell & Associates Kyle's law firm. The language was coldly professional, designed to intimidate. Your recent communications to our clients Ms. Hannah Reed and Ms. Evelyn Reed contain implicit threats of legal action based on unsubstantiated and potentially defamatory claims. We must advise you that any false accusations made publicly against our clients could constitute defamation harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We strongly recommend you cease all threatening communications and reconsider your current course of action. Failure to do so will result in swift legal consequences." Jennifer reviewed it and was blunt in her assessment. "It's a scare tactic, but it's also a legitimate warning. If you make any public statements about Hannah or Evelyn without ironclad proof, they can sue you for defamation, and they have the money to drag you through court for years. We need to be very careful about what we say and where we say it." But the most unsettling development came when I was walking Liam to school 3 days after sending my email. I noticed a black SUV parked on our street. Tinted windows, no visible driver, just sitting there. The next morning, it was back in the same spot. The third morning, I took a photo and sent it to Jennifer. Her response was immediate. "That's surveillance. They're documenting you, looking for anything they can use erratic behavior. Poor parenting decisions, meeting with people they can characterize as unsavory. The Reed family is building a counter case. They're preparing to paint you as an unfit mother if you push this confrontation. Be very careful. Assume you're being watched and recorded whenever you're in public." The paranoia crept in like fog. Was the car really there for surveillance, or was I being paranoid? Were the people I passed on the street just neighbors, or were some of them watching me for the Reeds? How far did their network extend? I tried to maintain normal routines to not let Liam see that I was rattled, but it was hard when every time I left the apartment I found myself scanning for that black SUV, wondering who was watching and what they were documenting. The breaking point came on the fourth morning. I opened my email to find a message from an address I didn't recognize. No subject line, no text in the body. Just an attachment. I almost deleted it thinking it was spam. But something made me click. It was a photograph, high resolution, taken that morning. It showed me walking Liam to school, my hand on his shoulder, both of us bundled against the December cold. The metadata showed it had been taken less than 2 hours ago. Below the image, a single line of text: "We're watching. Reconsider your choices." My hands shook as I forwarded it to Jennifer and called her immediately. "This is intimidation," she said, her voice tight with anger. "Possibly illegal intimidation. But Megan, it also tells us something important. They're scared, really scared. If they weren't, they wouldn't be resorting to this. They're trying to make you back down because they know you have something that threatens them." I looked at the photo again. Me and Liam captured without our knowledge, proof that we were being surveilled by people with resources and reach. For the first time since I'd sent that email, I felt a flutter of real fear. The surveillance photo could have broken me. That was what they wanted, to make me feel hunted, vulnerable, too scared to continue. But as I stared at that image of me and Liam, I felt something unexpected crystallize inside me. Not fear. Clarity. If they were willing to go this far, it meant Jennifer was right. They were terrified. And terrified people made mistakes. The evening of Hannah's Christmas dinner arrived like an approaching storm, the air electric with unspoken tension. I'd spent the day preparing, not just emotionally but strategically. When the town car I'd hired pulled up to my apartment building, Liam's eyes went wide. "Mom, why are we riding in that?" "Because tonight we're not arriving as people asking for permission to exist." I told him, helping him into the back seat. "Tonight we're arriving as people who know their worth." The drive to Hannah's estate took 20 minutes through increasingly affluent neighborhoods. When we pulled onto her street, I counted the cars already parked along the pristine driveway and curb. 30, maybe more. BMWs, Mercedes, Teslas. This wasn't the intimate family dinner Evelyn's text had suggested. This was a performance staged for an audience. Hannah had invited the entire Reed social circle. Every influential family friend, every business connection, every person whose opinion mattered in Boston's upper class. She was creating witnesses, people who would see whatever narrative she wanted to present and carry it back to their own networks. Public shame as a weapon. Social pressure as a control mechanism. The house itself looked like something from a magazine. Professional decorators had clearly spent days creating a winter wonderland. Lights dripped from every surface. Elegant wreaths hung in every window, and through the front windows I could see a Christmas tree that had to be 15 feet tall, decorated with what I knew were designer ornaments that cost more individually than my entire tree at home. All of it probably cost more than my annual rent. As our town car pulled to a stop, I saw movement in one of the upstairs windows. Evelyn watching. Her face was unreadable from this distance, but I could feel her calculating, adjusting her strategy based on this unexpected arrival. I took Liam's hand and walked up the driveway with my head high. The front door opened before we reached it, and there was Hannah in a red designer dress. Her makeup perfect, her smile bright and welcoming for the benefit of the guests. I could see behind her in the foyer. She embraced me warmly, the picture of sisterly affection. But as she pulled me close, her mouth near my ear, her voice dropped to a whisper, sharp as broken glass. "I hope you brought your lawyers. You're going to need them." I smiled for the watching crowd and whispered back, "Oh, I did better than that." Inside the house was filled with the sounds of expensive holiday cheer. A string quartet played in the corner. Waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that looked like small pieces of art. The guests were exactly who I'd expected, the same people who'd watched me be humiliated at countless Reed family events over the years, the same people who'd laughed politely at Evelyn's cutting remarks about me. The same people who'd never once questioned why one daughter was treated so differently from the other. Evelyn appeared like she'd been waiting for her cue, gliding across the room with practiced grace. She embraced me publicly warmly, making sure everyone nearby could see. "My dear daughter, I'm so glad you could join us. Family is everything, especially during the holidays." The performance was masterful. To anyone watching, she was the loving mother welcoming her daughter home. Several guests smiled approvingly. I heard someone murmur, "Such a close family." But when the attention shifted to Liam, when people bent down to greet him and comment on how handsome he looked, Evelyn leaned close to me and her voice changed entirely. "You think you're clever bringing documentation and lawyers?" The words were barely audible, her lips hardly moving. "Darling, I've controlled this town's legal system for 3 decades. Half the judges owe me favors. The DA's wife is on my charity board. Your attorneys are competent, I'm sure, but they're swimming in my ocean. And they will drown." She paused, straightening an ornament on a nearby garland, her movements casual and unhurried. "And Megan, if you truly love Liam, you'll remember that accidents can happen to anyone." Another pause, heavy with implication. "Even children." The threat landed like ice water in my veins. She was threatening my son. Not subtly, not vaguely, but directly. If I pushed this, Liam might have an accident. But I'd prepared for this moment. I'd known Evelyn would eventually show her true face, would make the kind of threat that revealed exactly how dangerous she was. I smiled, touching her arm gently, like a daughter might touch her mother, and spoke just as quietly. "That's interesting that you'd say that, because I've been recording our conversations for the past 3 months. Massachusetts is a single-party consent state, which means I don't need your permission. Every threat you've made, every whispered warning, every moment of psychological abuse, all documented." I watched her face drain of color just for a moment before she caught herself. "And before you consider any accidents," I continued, still smiling as though we were having a pleasant conversation about holiday plans. "I've already provided copies of these recordings to 3 separate attorneys with explicit instructions to file them immediately with law enforcement and the media if anything happens to me or Liam. So you'll want to make sure we both stay very, very safe." For the first time in my entire life, I saw something in Evelyn's eyes that wasn't contempt or cold calculation. It was respect. Cautious, grudging respect. And underneath that fear. "You've been busy," she said finally. "You taught me well," I replied. "You taught me that in this family you survive by being smarter than your enemies. Thank you for the education." She recovered quickly, I had to give her that. Within seconds, the mask was back in place, and she was moving through the crowd playing the perfect hostess. But something had shifted. The power dynamic had changed. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was a player in the game, and I'd just shown I knew how to play. Dinner began with an elaborate, multi-course meal that probably cost more per plate than I spent on groceries in a week. I sat between Liam and one of Evelyn's charity board friends, making polite conversation while watching the room, noting who was watching me, who was whispering to whom. Halfway through the main course, Liam tugged gently on my sleeve. His face was confused, curious in the way children get when they've overheard something they don't understand. "Mom," he whispered, "Aunt Hannah is crying in the kitchen. I heard her when I went to the bathroom. She's talking to someone on the phone and she sounded really upset." "About what, sweetheart?" He leaned closer, his voice even quieter. "She kept saying a name." "Grandma Sarah." "Who's Grandma Sarah?" "I thought Grandma Evelyn was our only grandma." Everything stopped. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the sounds of the party fading to white noise. Sarah. Hannah was on the phone crying about Sarah. How did Hannah know about Sarah? I looked toward the kitchen and saw Hannah slip back and her eyes red, her makeup hastily repaired. She caught me looking, and her expression was something I'd never seen on her face before. Not anger, not smugness, but genuine fear, mixed with something that might have been pleading. What was happening here was bigger than I'd realized, and it was all about to come apart. Sarah. The name hung in the air between me and Liam like a ghost made visible. I wanted to rush into the kitchen to demand answers from Hannah about what she knew and how she knew it. But that's exactly what the old Megan would have done, reacted emotionally, created a scene, and given them ammunition to use against me. The new Megan stayed seated and smiled at my son. "I'll tell you about Grandma Sarah later, sweetheart. For now, let's just enjoy our dinner." I could feel Evelyn watching me from across the room, trying to gauge whether I'd overheard what Liam said, whether I was about to cause the confrontation she'd been preparing for. I gave her nothing. Just calm. Just composure. Just the appearance of someone perfectly at ease. As we moved into the formal dining room for the main course, I found myself seated between Liam and one of Evelyn's longtime bridge partners. The seating arrangement was deliberate, I knew, positioned where Hannah could easily direct conversation my way, where the maximum number of guests could witness whatever humiliation she had planned. She didn't disappoint. Halfway through the entree, as conversation flowed around the table about holiday plans and charitable donations, Hannah turned to me with that perfect hostess smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Megan, I've been meaning to ask, how is everything going with you?" She paused just long enough for the table to quiet for attention to shift our way. "You know I worry about you sometimes. You're always so independent, never asking for help, even when you clearly need it. I really admire that stubborn pride." "I do." The implication was crystal clear to everyone listening. Poor Megan struggling but too proud to accept the family's generous assistance. Several guests glanced at me with that particular expression wealthy people get when they're feeling charitable pity. In the past, this is where I would have either stayed silent, letting the characterization stand unchallenged, or stumbled through some awkward defensive explanation that would only make me seem more pathetic. I could practically see Hannah waiting for one of those familiar responses, already planning her sympathetic follow-up that would dig the knife deeper. But I wasn't that Megan anymore. I set down my fork with deliberate care, smiled warmly at Hannah, and spoke with the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing your own worth. "I appreciate your concern, Hannah, but I think there's a difference between independence and pride. Independence is building a career and a life you're proud of, making your own choices, supporting yourself and your child through your own work. Pride is needing others to be less so you can feel like more." I paused, letting that land, then continued with genuine warmth in my voice. "I'm fortunate to have work I find meaningful, and more importantly, I'm teaching my son that worth comes from what you build with your own hands and heart, not from what you're given or what you take from others." The response was measured, dignified, and carried just enough subtle power to shift the dynamic completely. Several guests actually nodded in approval. One woman I didn't know said, "Hear, hear. That's a valuable lesson." I watched Hannah's smile tighten fractionally, the only visible sign that her weapon had not only failed but backfired. She recovered quickly, turning the conversation to safer topics, but something had changed at that table. People were looking at me differently, not with pity, but with a kind of reassessment. As the evening wore on, I noticed other shifts too. Evelyn kept trying to redirect conversation away from anything that might lead to uncomfortable questions, steering towards safe topics like the family's charitable foundation and upcoming society events. "Let's not focus on any petty disagreements tonight," she said at one point, her voice carrying that particular tone of benevolent authority. "We're here to celebrate family and the blessings we've received this year." But some guests seemed less willing than usual to simply accept the Reed family narrative without question. I caught curious glances, heard whispered conversations that stopped when I looked their way. The performance Evelyn and Hannah had staged wasn't working quite as smoothly as it usually did. During a lull after dinner, as people mingled in the living room, an elderly woman approached me. I recognized her immediately, Margaret Thompson, one of the Reed family's oldest friends. She'd known Mark and Evelyn since before Hannah was born, had attended every major family event for 4 decades. "Megan, dear," she said quietly, drawing me slightly away from the main group. "I wonder if I might have a word." Up close, her eyes were sharp and assessing behind her glasses. This wasn't a woman easily fooled by surface performances. "I've watched you grow up," she continued, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "Watched you at family dinners, holiday celebrations, all those events over the years. And I've always wondered something." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Why do they treat you so differently? You're clearly intelligent, clearly accomplished, clearly kind and capable. But I've never once seen Evelyn look at you the way a mother should look at her daughter. And I've never understood why." It was the first time in 30 years that anyone in the Reed social circle had openly acknowledged what I'd always known was visible to everyone but never discussed. The disparity, the difference, the fundamental wrongness of how I was treated compared to Hannah. I considered my response carefully. "That's a question I've been trying to answer my whole life, Mrs. Thompson. I'm starting to believe the answer has nothing to do with who I am or anything I've done. I think it has everything to do with secrets I'm only beginning to uncover." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If you need someone to talk to, someone who remembers how things were before you were born, you know where to find me." It wasn't an offer of help exactly, but it was acknowledgement, validation, and potentially access to information I didn't have. As the evening continued, I stayed vigilant about Liam, making sure he felt safe and valued, despite the undercurrents swirling through the adult world around him. During a quiet moment when most guests were occupied with dessert preparation, I took him aside to a quieter corner of the room. "Sweetheart," I said softly, "do you notice how some people here are using nice words but their faces look mean, and how some people are quiet but their kindness shows in their eyes?" He nodded, watching me carefully. "That's what I want you to remember. Real goodness doesn't need to perform for an audience. Real kindness doesn't need witnesses. And when people try to make you feel small, the most powerful thing you can do is stand tall and remember your own worth. You don't have to fight back with meanness. You just have to refuse to believe their lies about who you are." Liam was quiet for a moment, processing this in the way children do when they're trying to apply abstract concepts to concrete reality. Then he surprised me completely. He looked across the room to where Hannah was standing, talking to a group of guests. He straightened his small shoulders, lifted his chin, and gave her a small, dignified nod. Not hostile, not scared, not seeking approval, just a simple acknowledgement of her existence as a human being from one person of worth to another. Hannah saw it. Our eyes met across the room, and I saw her expression shift, confusion followed quickly by something that looked almost like unease. Liam had just demonstrated something powerful without saying a word. He'd shown that he wouldn't be broken, wouldn't be diminished, wouldn't accept the role of victim they were trying to assign him. Both Hannah and I recognized the significance of that moment, though for different reasons. As dessert was being served some elaborate confection that probably required advance ordering from an exclusive bakery, Hannah's phone rang. The sound cut through the polite conversation like a knife. She glanced at the screen and her face went completely pale. She stood abruptly, murmuring apologies to the guests at her table. "I'm so sorry, I need to take this. Please everyone continue." But before she left the room, she looked at me. Just for a second. And what I saw in her eyes wasn't anger or smugness or calculation. It was genuine fear. Hannah didn't return to the dining room. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and the polite dinner conversation continued around empty chairs, guests glancing occasionally at the doorway with barely concealed curiosity. I could see Evelyn's jaw tightening with each passing minute, her smile becoming more strained as she tried to maintain the illusion that everything was perfectly normal. I excused myself quietly, telling the woman next to me I was just checking on Liam in the playroom. But instead of turning left toward where the children were watching a holiday movie, I turned right, following the faint sound of Hannah's voice deeper into the house. I found her in what appeared to be Kyle's study, a masculine room with dark wood paneling and leather furniture. She was standing with her back to the door phone still clutched in her hand, her shoulders rigid with a tension that looked painful. She wasn't crying, but her whole body radiated stress in a way I'd never seen from perfect, polished Hannah. When I stepped into the room, the floorboard creaked. She knew I was there, but she didn't turn around immediately. Instead, she spoke to the wall, her voice stripped of all its usual performance. "That was my therapist returning my emergency call." A laugh, bitter and broken. "She wanted to know if I was safe. Isn't that pathetic? I'm standing in my own home in my designer dress hosting a dinner party that cost more than most people make in a month, and my therapist is worried about my safety." I closed the door quietly behind me, giving us privacy. "Are you safe?" She finally turned to face me, and I was stunned by what I saw. The carefully maintained facade had cracks running through it like a windshield after impact. Her makeup was smudged slightly around one eye where she'd wiped away tears. Her hands were shaking. This wasn't the Hannah I'd known my entire life, the perfect daughter, the golden child, the woman who always had everything under control. "Do you want to know what the earlier call was about?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The one Liam heard when I mentioned Sarah." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, afraid any word might spook her back into her defensive shell. "Mother has been calling me every hour since you sent that email with your lawyers copied. Every single hour, Megan. Giving me instructions. Specific scripts for what to say, how to position you as unstable, how to document everything to build a custody case against you if needed." She was speaking faster now, words tumbling out like they'd been dammed up for too long. "She told me exactly what to post on Instagram, exactly what comments to make at dinner, exactly how to play the loving sister trying to help her troubled sibling." Hannah's voice broke on the last word, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, like she could physically hold back whatever was trying to escape. "And she keeps saying..." Hannah looked at me with eyes that were genuinely terrified. "She keeps saying that if I fail to manage this situation, if I can't control you, I'll end up like Sarah. Just like that. You'll end up like Sarah, Hannah." Like it's the worst threat she can imagine. My heart was pounding. "Who is Sarah?" "I don't know." The words came out almost like a sob. "That's the thing, Megan. I don't know. Our mother has been using that name as a threat my entire life. When I was 7 and got a B on a test, don't disappoint me or you'll end up like Sarah. When I was 16 and wanted to go to prom with a boy she didn't approve of, Sarah made choices like that. Look where it got her. When I was 25 and suggested maybe I wanted to travel before settling down, Sarah was selfish too. Remember what happened?" She was pacing now, her expensive heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "But she's never explained who Sarah was, never told me what happened to her, just used her name like this cautionary tale, this ghost hovering over everything I did. And I was too afraid to ask because asking questions made Mother angry." I watched her unravel this woman who'd been my tormentor for 30 years, and I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, not vindication. something closer to recognition. We'd both been victims, just in different ways. "Hannah," I said carefully, "I don't think either of us has ever been allowed to be ourselves in this family. We've both been assigned roles to play. You as the perfect heir, me as the acceptable failure. But what if those roles were designed specifically to keep us from asking the questions that actually matter?" She stopped pacing, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we've been fighting the wrong war. Maybe the enemy isn't each other. Maybe it's the system that pitted us against each other from the beginning." I took a step closer. "Help me figure out who Sarah was. Help me understand what Mother is so afraid of. Because I think she's the key to everything, why Mother treats me the way she does, why she controls you so completely, why our entire family is built on fear instead of love." For a moment, Hannah looked like she might say yes. She actually took a step toward me, her hand half raised like she was reaching for something. An alliance, a lifeline, a way out. But then we both heard it. Evelyn's voice in the hallway calling with perfect maternal warmth. "Girls, is everything all right? Our guests are asking after you." Hannah's expression changed instantly, like a door slamming shut. The vulnerability disappeared. The mask snapped back into place, and suddenly, she was perfect. Hannah again composed, controlled, untouchable. "We should get back," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "Hannah." "We should get back," she repeated more firmly this time and walked past me toward the door. I followed her back to the dining room. Frustration and disappointment churning in my gut. I'd been so close to breaking through, so close to finding an ally in the most unexpected place. But Evelyn's voice had pulled Hannah back like a puppet on strings, and the moment was lost. As we re-entered the main room trying to look like we'd just been having a casual sisterly chat, Margaret Thompson appeared at my elbow. The elderly woman glanced around quickly to make sure no one was paying attention to us, then pressed something small into my hand. "I found this in Mark's study last year when I was helping him look for some documents," she whispered. "I kept meaning to ask him about it, but then he got sick and it didn't seem important. But after tonight, after watching you and listening to the things not being said, I think you should have it." She squeezed my hand once, then moved away before anyone could notice the exchange. I waited until I was back at my seat before I looked down at what she'd given me. It was a photograph, old and slightly faded, the kind that came from the era before digital cameras. It showed a young woman, maybe mid-20s, standing in front of what looked like the Reed family mansion. She was smiling, genuinely happy, her arms spread wide like she was embracing the world. And she looked exactly like me. The same dark hair, the same facial structure, the same smile I saw when I looked in the mirror. It was like looking at a photograph of myself from a life I'd never lived. I turned it over. On the back in Mark's handwriting, Sarah, 1996, before everything changed. I slipped the photograph into my purse with hands that trembled slightly, trying to process what I was seeing. Sarah. A woman who looked exactly like me. A woman Mark had cared enough about to keep her photograph. A woman who, according to his note on the back, had experienced something that changed everything in 1996. But before I could fully absorb this revelation, Hannah was standing tapping her wine glass with a fork to get everyone's attention. The room quieted immediately, all eyes turning to her with the kind of automatic deference people give to those who've been performing for an audience their entire lives. "I want to take a moment to address something important," she said, her voice carrying that perfect blend of vulnerability and strength that I recognized as carefully rehearsed. "There have been some misunderstandings recently within our family. My sister Megan felt that I was unwelcoming toward her and Liam, and I want to apologize publicly if my words were ever hurtful." She turned to Liam, and I watched her face transform into an expression of such apparent sincerity that even I almost believed it. She moved toward him, kneeling down to his eye level in a gesture that looked spontaneous, but was perfectly calculated for maximum emotional impact. "Liam, sweetheart," she said, her voice catching just slightly. If I ever made you feel like you didn't belong in this family, I am truly sorry. You are my nephew, and you are always, always welcome in my home." She opened her arms, and after a moment's hesitation, Liam, sweet, forgiving Liam, who couldn't yet understand the layers of manipulation at work, hugged her back. The room erupted in soft sounds of approval. I saw one of Evelyn's friends actually wipe away tears. Another woman said audibly, "What a beautiful moment of healing." I sat frozen, recognizing the strategic brilliance of what Hannah had just done. She'd positioned herself as the gracious, mature sister seeking reconciliation, while implicitly painting me as the one who'd created unnecessary drama over innocent misunderstandings. She'd apologized in a way that accepted no actual wrongdoing, "if I made you feel," rather than "for making you feel," while appearing magnanimous and emotionally generous. And most devastatingly, she'd done it in front of 30 witnesses who would now carry this narrative back to their own social circles. By tomorrow, the story circulating through Boston's upper class wouldn't be "Hannah verbally abused a child." It would be "Hannah graciously apologized to her oversensitive sister who misinterpreted an innocent comment." Before I could formulate any response, Evelyn stood as well, placing a hand on Hannah's shoulder in a gesture of maternal pride and solidarity. "You know," Evelyn said, addressing the room with the warm wisdom of a beloved matriarch, "families are complicated. We don't always communicate perfectly. My dear Megan has always been particularly sensitive, interpreting things in ways that others don't intend." She turned to look at me with an expression of such convincing maternal concern that I wanted to scream. When she was young, the school counselors suggested she might benefit from therapy to help her process emotions in more typical ways. And of course, we supported her through that because that's what families do. We love and support each other even when it's difficult. The words landed exactly as Evelyn intended. With just a few carefully chosen sentences, she'd planted the suggestion that I had a documented history of psychological issues and emotional misinterpretation. And she'd done it while sounding loving, supportive, and slightly martyred, the long-suffering mother who'd done her best with a difficult child. I could see the shift happening in real time. Guests who'd been watching me with curiosity or sympathy now looked at me with that particular expression, concern mixed with doubt. Is this poor woman projecting old childhood issues onto current situations? Has she always struggled with interpreting social interactions correctly? I felt the room's perception of me changing, solidifying into the narrative Evelyn had just constructed. And I realized with cold clarity that if I protested now, if I tried to present evidence or defend myself, I would only confirm their suspicions. Anything I said would sound defensive, would seem like exactly the kind of oversensitivity and misinterpretation they now believed was my lifelong pattern. I was being outmaneuvered in real time, and fighting back would only make it worse. So I made a tactical decision. I stood, smoothed my dress, and smiled at Hannah with what I hoped looked like genuine warmth rather than the calculated performance it actually was. "Thank you, Hannah. I appreciate you saying that." I looked at Evelyn. "And thank you, Mother, for your support over the years." The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but I forced them out with apparent sincerity. To the guests, it looked like family harmony had been restored. The tension dissolved into relieved smiles and resumed conversation. Several people came up to tell me how glad they were that we'd worked things out, how important family was, how beautiful it was to see reconciliation. But I wasn't fighting the battle they thought I was fighting. I was gathering intelligence. I was watching who in this room seemed genuinely moved by Hannah's performance and who looked skeptical. I noted that Margaret Thompson hadn't joined the applause, that she was watching Evelyn with an expression I couldn't quite read. I observed that one of Mark's former business partners, a man I barely knew named Robert Chen, was studying the whole scene with narrowed, thoughtful eyes that suggested he saw more than surface theater. And most importantly, I'd watched Hannah's face during that apology. I'd spent 30 years learning to read micro-expressions to catch the tiny tells that revealed truth from performance. And I'd seen it, the brief flash of calculation, before she spoke, the way her eyes didn't quite match the emotion in her voice. the slight tension in her shoulders that indicated she was delivering memorized lines rather than speaking from genuine feeling. Hannah was very good, but I'd learned from the best manipulators in Boston, and I could see the performance for what it was. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I collected Liam and prepared to go. But before I walked out the door, I made sure to have one final moment alone with Evelyn in the hallway. "You won tonight's performance," I told her quietly, my voice carrying no emotion. The audience loved it. Very convincing. Her eyes narrowed slightly. I reached into my purse and showed her just the edge of the photograph Margaret had given me, just enough for her to recognize it. "But, Mother," I continued, "I have this now, and we both know this isn't over." For just a moment, I saw genuine fear flicker across her face before she regained control. Later that night, after Liam was asleep, I sat at my kitchen table and finally opened the full packet from Mark's attorney. I'd been avoiding it since it arrived, afraid of what I might find, overwhelmed by everything else happening. But now I needed to know. The top page was a handwritten letter several pages long in Mark's familiar script. My hands shook as I began to read. "Megan, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I can finally tell you the truth. You are not my daughter. You are my niece. Your mother was my sister Sarah, and Evelyn killed her." I sat at my kitchen table until 3 a.m, reading Mark's letter over and over until I'd memorized every word. Your mother was my sister Sarah, and Evelyn killed her. The words didn't seem real. They felt like something from a thriller novel, not my actual life. But the documents he'd included old police reports, newspaper clippings about Sarah's accidental death in 1997, financial records showing suspicious transactions painted a picture that was horrifyingly plausible. I finally fell asleep on the couch, still fully dressed, Mark's letter clutched in my hand, like a talisman against nightmares. The knock on my door came at 8 a.m, harsh and authoritative. I jerked awake, disoriented, my neck aching from the awkward angle I'd slept in. Through the peephole, I saw Evelyn standing in the hallway, perfectly composed in a tailored coat and leather gloves, as if showing up unannounced at someone's apartment before 9 on a Sunday morning was perfectly normal behavior. I considered not answering. But that would only delay the inevitable, and I needed to know what her next move would be. I opened the door without greeting her, just stepped back to let her in. She walked past me into my living room, looking around with that particular expression wealthy people get when they're in spaces smaller than their closets, not quite disdain, but close. "We need to talk," she said, settling onto my couch without being invited. "Just the two of us, honestly, for once." I stayed standing, arms crossed. "I'm listening." She took her time removing her gloves finger by finger, a gesture so deliberate it had to be calculated. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it, almost gentle. "Megan, I think it's time I explain some things about your background because clearly Mark filled your head with confusion before he died." She looked up at me with what might have been genuine sadness. "You were born to a young woman named Sarah, Mark's sister, my sister-in-law. She was troubled, dear, deeply troubled, unstable in ways that were heartbreaking to witness." I said nothing, letting her spin whatever story she'd come here to tell. "She got involved with an inappropriate man, someone completely unsuitable from a different social class, different values. She became pregnant with you, and the family was devastated. We tried to help her, tried to provide support, but she refused all assistance. She wanted to raise you alone without family input." Evelyn's voice took on a tone of regretful acceptance. "And then she died, tragically. A car accident when you were barely 2 years old. Mark and I took you in because it was the right thing to do. We gave you a home, a family, everything we could provide." She paused, studying my face for reaction. When I gave her none, she continued. "But Sarah's instability. Megan, those things can run in families. Genetic predispositions to mental health issues, difficulty regulating emotions, paranoid thinking. I've watched for signs in you your whole life, and I have to tell you, some of your recent behavior has been concerning. Very concerning." There it was. She was laying the groundwork, creating a narrative where my mental health could be questioned, where any accusations I made could be dismissed as delusional thinking inherited from my unstable mother. "Is that why you came here?" I asked, my voice flat. "To tell me I'm crazy, like Sarah supposedly was?" "I came here to help you understand your situation before you make choices you'll regret." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. "There's something else you should know. Your grandfather established a trust fund before he died in 1985. The terms are very specific. Beneficiaries must be legally competent to manage their own affairs." She opened the folder, showing me documents I couldn't quite read from where I was standing. "Given Sarah's documented psychological issues before her death, and given your own history of emotional sensitivity, I want to make sure you understand the legal landscape you're operating in." Her voice was still gentle, but there was steel underneath now. "If at any point you were to be deemed unable to manage your own affairs, say if you exhibited behavior suggesting psychological distress, or if you made wild accusations against family members that suggested a break from reality, that trust could be transferred to a court-appointed guardian." She let that sink in for a moment. "For your protection, of course, and for Liam's." The threat was sophisticated and absolutely terrifying. She wasn't just saying she could take my inheritance. She was saying she could have me declared legally incompetent, which could impact my parental rights, my ability to work my entire future. You can't just have someone declared incompetent because you don't like what they're saying. I managed, though. My voice wasn't as steady as I wanted it to be. "No," Evelyn agreed. "But with a documented family history of mental illness, evidence of erratic recent behavior, witness testimony from concerned family members, and a court system that takes mental health very seriously when children are involved." She tilted her head. "It's more feasible than you might think." She stood smoothing her coat, preparing to leave. But as she walked past my mantelpiece, she paused at the photograph of Liam I kept there. She picked it up, studying it with an expression I couldn't read. "Beautiful child," she said softly. "He has Sarah's eyes, you know. That same intensity, that same defiance." She set the frame down carefully. "Children are so vulnerable, Megan. They depend entirely on their parents for safety, for stability. It would be devastating if anything were to compromise his security, his stable home environment." She turned to face me directly, and her eyes were cold. "I've protected this family for 30 years by making difficult choices. Choices other people might not understand, but that were necessary. Don't force me to make another one." The implication was crystal clear. If I continued investigating Sarah's death, if I continued threatening Evelyn's control, something might happen to Liam. An accident. An incident. Something that would remove him from my care, or worse. I stood frozen as she walked to the door, my mind screaming, but my body unable to move. "The hearing is in 2 weeks, she said, turning the doorknob. "I suggest you use that time to think very carefully about what kind of mother you want to be. One who protects her son by accepting reality, or one who destroys him by chasing fantasies." After she left, I stood in the middle of my living room, shaking so hard I had to sit down before my legs gave out. Evelyn hadn't just threatened me, she'd threatened Liam. And worse, she'd done it in a way that was completely deniable if I ever tried to report it. I grabbed my phone and called Jennifer, not caring that it was Sunday morning, not caring about anything except getting legal help immediately. She answered on the 3rd ring, and I could hear sleep in her voice. "Megan, what's wrong?" "Evelyn was just here. She threatened Liam. She said—" "Slow down. What exactly did she say?" I repeated the conversation as accurately as I could, my words tumbling over each other. Jennifer was silent for a long moment after I finished. "Megan, I need to tell you something. I was going to call you tomorrow, but since you're on the line this morning, I received a court filing. Evelyn Reed is petitioning for a psychological evaluation of your fitness as a parent." My blood turned to ice. "What? She's claiming erratic behavior, paranoid accusations against family members, and a pattern of emotional instability that may pose a risk to your minor child." The petition cites your recent confrontational emails, your hiring of multiple attorneys for unclear purposes, and witness statements from family members expressing concern about your mental state. She's doing exactly what she threatened, I whispered. We have a hearing in 2 weeks, Jennifer continued, her voice grim. And Megan, I won't lie to you, with her resources and connections, this is going to be a real fight. The court petition felt like a noose tightening around my neck. 2 weeks. I had 2 weeks before a hearing that could determine whether I was deemed fit to raise my own son. 2 weeks to prove I wasn't the unstable, paranoid woman Evelyn was painting me to be. 2 weeks to build a case strong enough to counter a family with unlimited resources and decades of carefully constructed social capital. But I couldn't build that case without understanding what I was really fighting against. I needed to know the full truth about Sarah, about what happened in 1997, about why Evelyn was so desperate to keep these secrets buried that she'd threaten a child. After Jennifer and I finished strategizing our legal defense, I returned to Mark's letter. I'd read the opening lines that first night, but I'd been too shocked to process the full document. Now I forced myself to read every word multiple times, letting the truth sink in like water into parched ground. His handwriting deteriorated as the pages went on, becoming shakier and less controlled evidence of the pain he must have been in when he wrote this. The letter was emotionally raw in a way Mark had never been in life, written clearly by a dying man who knew this was his last chance to unburden his conscience. Megan, my beautiful niece. It began, and even that opening broke something inside me. Not daughter, niece. I have lived with cowardice for 30 years, and now I'm paying for it with cancer eating through my body. You deserve to know the truth. Your mother was my older sister, Sarah Elizabeth Reed. She was brilliant, kind, passionate about life. Everything I wasn't brave enough to be. He described how Sarah fell in love with a graduate student in 1994, a man named John Callahan, who was studying environmental science. Their parents were horrified because John wasn't from their social class, didn't have the right connections, didn't fit the Reed family image. When Sarah became pregnant, they threatened to disown her. But Sarah didn't care. She was happy, Mark wrote, radiant. When you were born in January 1995, Sarah was the happiest I'd ever seen her. She named you Megan Sarah, hoping you'd inherit her strength, her courage to live authentically despite family pressure. The letter grew darker as it detailed what came next. Mark and Sarah's parents died in late 1996, making Sarah the primary Reed heir, according to their grandfather's will. And Evelyn, who'd been trying for years to have children, and couldn't suddenly face the prospect of being completely sidelined in the family hierarchy. Evelyn's fear turned into something darker, Mark wrote. I saw the way she looked at Sarah. I heard her on the phone making plans, arranging things I didn't fully understand. In March 1997, Sarah's car crashed on a rural road. Brake failure, the police said. Poor maintenance. But after the funeral, I was going through Sarah's files and found receipts showing Evelyn had been at the auto shop where Sarah's car was serviced just days before the accident. I suspected but couldn't prove. I told myself I was being paranoid. Then came the detail that made my hands shake so badly I almost dropped the pages. 2 weeks after Sarah died, John Callahan died in a single car accident. Same type of crash. Same explanation, brake failure. 2 people both connected to you, both dead within weeks of each other. I knew then. I knew what Evelyn had done, but I was too afraid to act. I was a coward, Megan. I took you in, loved you as my own, but I let Evelyn treat you terribly because I thought keeping you in the family, even in pain, was better than exposing the truth and risking that you'd be taken away, or worse. The letter ended with an apology that felt both genuine and inadequate. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Please forgive me, and please protect yourself and Liam. Evelyn will do anything to protect her secrets. I sat with that letter for hours reading it until I'd memorized every line. Then I did what I should have done immediately. I hired help. Not local help. Anyone in Boston might have connections to the Reed family or be susceptible to their influence. I needed someone completely outside their sphere of control. Through Jennifer's network, I found Robert Chen, a former FBI agent who'd moved to New York after retiring and now specialized in cold cases. His reputation was impeccable, and more importantly, he had no ties to Massachusetts society. Within a week, Chen had preliminary findings that both confirmed Mark's story and raised even more disturbing questions. Sarah Elizabeth Reed, born 1970, died March 15, 1997 at age 27. Single vehicle accident on a rural Massachusetts road outside of Boston. Police report noted brake failure, but concluded it was due to poor maintenance. Sarah allegedly hadn't had her car serviced in over a year, which Chen noted was suspicious given that Sarah was a responsible professional woman who'd never had other incidents. John Callahan, 29, died March 29, 1997. Graduate student in environmental science at Boston University. Single vehicle accident. Brake failure. The obituary mentioned he was survived by his parents in Oregon, but made no mention of Sarah or a daughter. What's more interesting, Chen told me over the phone, is what's missing. There are virtually no public records of Sarah after 1992. No newspaper mentions, no professional records, no trace of her existence in any public databases. For someone from a prominent family, that's unusual. It's like someone systematically erased her from the public record. Someone. We both knew who. On a cold Saturday morning, I drove alone to the cemetery where Sarah was buried. Chen had located the grave in a modest section far from the prominent Reed family mausoleum, where the grandparents and other relatives were interred. Even in death, Sarah had been separated from the family. The headstone was simple granite, smaller than I expected. Sarah Elizabeth Reed, 1970 to 1997, beloved sister and mother. Someone had left roses. Fresh roses, pink and still fragrant. I knelt down, touching the cold stone, and let myself cry for the first time since this all began. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs for the mother I never knew, for the life we could have had for 30 years of lies and manipulation. "I'm sorry I never knew you," I whispered to the stone. "I'm sorry Mark didn't have the courage to tell me sooner. But I promise you I will find out what really happened. And if Evelyn did what he suspected, what I know she did, I will make sure she pays for what she took from both of us." As I was leaving the cemetery, groundskeeper approached an older man with kind eyes. "You're the daughter, aren't you?" he said. "You look just like the pictures." Pictures. The gentleman who used to visit. He'd show me pictures, sometimes tell me about his sister. Came once a month like clockwork for years. Always brought roses. Never stayed long, though. Just stood there looking sad. He paused. Stopped coming about 3-4 months ago. I wondered what happened to him. Mark. Mark had been visiting Sarah's grave every month for nearly 30 years, carrying his guilt and his silence, unable to tell the truth, but unable to let her go. That evening, sitting in my apartment with Liam already asleep, I checked my email and found a message from an address I didn't recognize. No subject line, no text in the body, just an attachment. I almost deleted it as spam, but something made me click. It was a scanned photograph, slightly faded but clear enough. The date stamp in the corner read March 1996. Sarah sat on what looked like the front steps of the Reed mansion, holding a baby me, both of us smiling at the camera with identical expressions of pure joy. But what made my blood freeze was the figure standing slightly behind them, partially out of frame. Evelyn. And her expression was nothing like the careful masks she usually wore. It was pure, undisguised hatred. The photograph of Evelyn's hatred haunted me through a sleepless night. That expression, raw, unfiltered malice directed at a woman holding a baby, told me everything I needed to know about what had really happened in 1997. But knowing the truth and proving it were entirely different challenges, especially when I had less than 2 weeks before a court hearing that could cost me custody of my son. I met Jennifer at her office first thing Monday morning, spreading out everything I had on her conference table. Mark's letter, the photograph from Margaret, the anonymous email with Evelyn's hateful expression, Chen's preliminary investigative findings. She studied each piece carefully, making notes, her legal mind already working through strategies. Evelyn is trying to establish a narrative of mental instability before you can present any evidence against her, Jennifer said, finally looking up at me with serious eyes. She's smart. If she gets a court order for psychological evaluation and you're fighting it, anything you say about Sarah's murder will be framed as paranoid delusion. Classic Darvo deny attack, reverse victim and offender. We need to flip this completely. How? You voluntarily undergo psychological evaluation with an independent expert of our choosing. We do it before the court-ordered evaluation. Establish your mental fitness proactively. We get documentation that you're stable, rational, processing grief and family conflict in healthy ways. She tapped her pen against her notepad. And then we go on offense. We petition for Hannah to undergo similar evaluations, citing her documented history of therapy, which you mentioned she has, and the emotional manipulation she's experienced. We don't accuse directly, we just express concern for her well-being given the family dynamics. Won't that make me look vindictive? Not if we frame it correctly. You're a concerned sister worried about the intense pressure Hannah's under from Evelyn. It neutralizes Evelyn's attack while building your case that the real instability in this family isn't you, it's the control system Evelyn has created. Jennifer leaned forward. But Megan, you need to start documenting everything. Every interaction with Evelyn, every threat, every manipulation. Timestamps, detailed notes, recordings when legal. If this becomes the battle I think it will, we need evidence showing a pattern of harassment toward you. I started that documentation immediately, creating a detailed timeline of events going back months. The exclusion of Liam from family events, Hannah's use of the word bastard. Evelyn's threats both veiled and direct the surveillance I'd noticed. Everything Jennifer and I could think of that established a pattern. But documentation alone wouldn't be enough. I needed allies. People who knew the truth about Sarah and were willing to speak it. Margaret Thompson had given me her phone number when she'd pressed Sarah's photograph into my hand at the Christmas dinner. I called her that afternoon, and her response was immediate. Come to my home tomorrow, alone. We have much to discuss. Her house was a graceful Victorian in one of Boston's older neighborhoods, the kind of place that had been in the same family for generations. She welcomed me with tea and sympathy, settling me into her living room before getting straight to the point. I was Sarah's godmother, she said without preamble. I loved that girl like my own daughter. She was brilliant, kind, full of life and possibility. When she died, I knew immediately something was wrong. The timing, the circumstances, and Evelyn's reaction, or lack of it. Most people show some emotion when a family member dies, even if it's complicated. Evelyn showed nothing but barely concealed satisfaction. Why didn't you say anything? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I tried. I went to Mark, told him my suspicions. He begged me to stay silent for your safety. He said if I stirred things up, if I made Evelyn feel threatened, she might see you as a problem that needed solving rather than just an inconvenient burden. He was terrified for you. She wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. I've regretted that silence for 28 years. But Mark was already raising you, and I thought silence was protecting you. I was wrong. She led me to a back room where several boxes were stacked against the wall. Mark brought me these over the years. Sarah's belongings that he managed to save before Evelyn destroyed everything else. I've kept them safe, waiting for the day when you'd be ready to know the truth. We spent 3 hours going through the boxes together. Sarah's journals full of her thoughts and dreams and fears. Photographs of her with John Callahan, the two of them looking so young and in love. Letters she'd written to me as a baby, planning to give them to me when I was older. Letters I was only reading now at 30 years old. And then we found the diary entries from early 1997, just weeks before her death. Sarah's handwriting growing more agitated, more afraid. Evelyn watches me with such coldness. Mark says I'm imagining things, but I know she resents me. She makes comments about how I don't deserve the Reed inheritance, how I'm destroying the family with my inappropriate choices. I need to protect Megan. I'm setting up accounts and safeguards in case anything happens to me." She'd known. Sarah had known Evelyn was dangerous, and she'd tried to protect me even then. Meanwhile, Chen was making progress on the investigative front. He called me on Wednesday with an update that made my pulse race. I found the mechanic who serviced Sarah's car in March 1997. Carlos Rodriguez. He's retired now, living in New Hampshire, and he's willing to talk. More than willing, he's been carrying guilt about this for 28 years. What did he say? He said he told the police something was off. Those brakes didn't fail from normal wear. Someone had tampered with the hydraulic line, made it look like gradual deterioration, but he'd worked on that car 4 months prior and it was perfect. The police wrote it off as him covering his ass for supposedly shoddy work, but Rodriguez kept his own notes and photos from the inspection. He still has them. Chen's voice grew more intense. And there's more. I pulled Evelyn's financial records from that period, took some doing, but I have contacts. 3 days before Sarah's death, Evelyn withdrew $50,000 in cash. No explanation, no record of where it went. That's the kind of money you pay someone to do a job you don't want traced. Is it enough to prosecute? It's building toward enough. We have motive. Sarah was the primary heir. We have opportunity. Evelyn had access to the car. We have evidence of tampering from a credible mechanic. We have suspicious financial transactions. But Megan Evelyn's had 28 years to cover her tracks. We need more. Something definitive. That night, as I was putting Liam to bed, my phone rang. Hannah's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Her voice was shaking barely above a whisper. "Megan, I need to talk to you. Alone. Tomorrow. Please." "About what?" A pause. Then, "I found something in Mother's safe. Documents. Evidence. I think you need to see it. But Megan, I'm scared. I don't know what to do." I agreed to meet Hannah the next morning, choosing a coffee shop 30 miles outside Boston, where neither of us was likely to be recognized. Jennifer warned me it could be a trap, but I went anyway, bringing my phone with recording enabled and a text scheduled to send to Jennifer if I didn't cancel it within 2 hours. Hannah was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her back to the wall. The first thing I noticed was how different she looked. Her hair, usually perfectly styled, was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her makeup was minimal, almost non-existent. She wore jeans and a sweater instead of her usual designer outfits. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. When she saw me, she didn't smile or perform any social pleasantries. She just gestured to the seat across from her and began speaking before I'd even sat down. "I need you to understand something," she said, her voice raw and urgent. "I've spent my entire life being Evelyn's masterpiece, her perfect creation, her proof that she could build something superior out of nothing. Every decision I've ever made was choreographed by her. Where I went to school, what I studied, who I married, how I dressed, what I posted on social media, all of it approved or dictated by Mother." I stayed silent, letting her talk. "I thought that was what family meant, what love looked like. Strict but caring, right? High standards but supportive." Her voice cracked. "But after the Christmas dinner, after I saw you stand up to her with those lawyers, and that evidence, after I heard her on the phone threatening you, threatening Liam, I started really looking at my life. And I realized something terrifying." She looked at me with eyes that were genuinely haunted. "I don't actually know who I am under all the training. I don't have authentic preferences. I don't know if I really like the clothes I wear, or the food I eat, or the career I have. I don't have genuine relationships. Everyone in my life is either someone Mother approved of, or someone useful for the family image. I'm a carefully constructed performance, Megan, and I'm 33 years old, and I've never been real." She pulled a manila folder from the bag beside her and slid it across the table with trembling hands. "This is from Mother's safe. I discovered the combination after Father died. It was his birthday backwards. I think she wanted me to find it eventually. I think it was insurance proof of her control over me, evidence she could use if I ever stepped out of line." I opened the folder carefully, not sure what to expect. The first document was a psychological evaluation dated 1996, signed by a Dr. Richard Morrison. It was an assessment of Sarah Elizabeth Reed. I scanned through the clinical language until I reached the conclusion. Patient presents as psychologically sound and mentally competent. No evidence of mood disorders, psychotic features, or personality dysfunction. Prognosis, excellent. The next document was similar, but it was about me dated 2003, when I would have been 8 years old. Megan Reed displays age-appropriate emotional regulation and cognitive function. No signs of pathology or developmental concerns. Do you understand what you're looking at? Hannah asked quietly. Those are real psychological evaluations that directly contradict everything Mother has ever said about Sarah being unstable or you having emotional problems. She lied, Megan. She's been lying for decades. I kept reading. The next section was worse. Private investigator reports from 1996 and early 1997 surveillance logs documenting Sarah's daily life in disturbing detail. Where she went, who she met with, what she bought at the grocery store. One entry from February 1997 noted, "Subject maintains regular schedule, shows no signs of instability or risky behavior. Relationship with child appears healthy and appropriate. Subject has established savings account in child's name." Evelyn had been monitoring Sarah like a stalker, gathering information, looking for weaknesses. And then I found the handwritten note and my hands started shaking so badly I almost dropped the papers. It was in Evelyn's distinctive script dated March 10th, 1997. 5 days before Sarah died. She will never give up her inheritance voluntarily. Other measures necessary. Other measures necessary. That was a murder plan. Written in black ink on Reed family stationery as casual as a grocery list. I didn't understand what I was reading at first, Hannah whispered. I thought maybe Mother was trying to help Sarah to document her condition for treatment or something. But then I kept digging and found financial records. Payments to Rodriguez Auto Service, the same shop where Sarah's car was serviced. $50,000 3 days before Sarah died. And then I found another payment. $25,000 to someone named J. Callahan on March 20th, 1997. My blood turned to ice. John Callahan was my father. I know. I searched the name and found his obituary. Died March 29th, 1997. Hannah's voice broke. Megan, I think Mother didn't just kill your mother. I think she killed your father, too. She paid the mechanic to tamper with Sarah's brakes, and then she paid your father maybe as hush money, maybe as a setup, and then arranged for him to die, too. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't process this. 2 murders. Evelyn had committed 2 murders to steal an inheritance and hide her crimes. Hannah was crying now, tears running down her face unchecked. There's more. I found my own psychiatric evaluations dating back to when I was 7 years old. Every 6 months for 18 years, Mother took me to a doctor who gave me medication for anxiety and obsessive tendencies. I took those pills religiously because Mother said I needed them to be healthy. She pulled out another document, hands shaking. But these evaluations are fake. The doctor, Dr. Harrison, had his license revoked in 2015 for fraudulent diagnoses. He was running a pill mill diagnosing conditions that didn't exist so he could prescribe medication. Mother was medicating me unnecessarily for 18 years, Megan, creating a paper trail that I was mentally unstable. I think she was preparing to do to me what she did to Sarah, establish instability, then eliminate me if I ever became a threat. I looked at Hannah and saw not the polished golden child who'd tormented me for 30 years, but a woman who'd just discovered she was a victim of the same monster I'd been fighting. I thought she loved me, Hannah said, her voice breaking completely. I thought being her perfect daughter meant I was safe. But I'm just as disposable as anyone else who gets in her way. The only difference is I've been useful so far. She's been grooming me my entire life to be either her heir or her scapegoat, depending on what she needs. Hannah reached across the table and grabbed my hand, gripping it with desperate strength. There's something else in the safe. A document labeled Reed Estate Trust Original Will. Megan, I think everything we believe about the family inheritance is a lie. Hannah pulled another document from the folder with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. This is what I found underneath everything else. The Reed Estate Trust. The original one from 1985. I took it from her, scanning the formal legal language until I reached the key section. The words seemed to blur and refocus as I read them. The Reed estate shall be divided as follows: 60% to our daughter Sarah Elizabeth Reed and her direct descendants. 40% to our son Mark Reed and his direct descendants. In the event that Sarah predeceases her children, her share shall pass to said children upon reaching age 25, with Mark Reed serving as trustee until that time. I read it again, then a third time. The implications crashed over me in waves. 60%. Sarah's share was 60% of the entire Reed estate, and it should have passed to me, her direct descendant, when I turned 25, 5 years ago. How much? I asked, my voice barely working. How much is the estate worth? Hannah flipped to another page. An appraisal document from last year. $75 million total. Sarah's 60% would be $45 million. $45 million. For 5 years, I'd been legally entitled to $45 million, and I'd been living in a modest apartment, carefully budgeting, worrying about Liam's future, while Evelyn controlled everything. But even as the shock of that number settled over me, I saw the problem. The trust said direct descendants of Sarah Elizabeth Reed. I was Sarah's daughter, yes, but this trust was written in 1985, 10 years before I was born. Did Sarah establish my legal status before she died? I asked Hannah. Did she update the trust or file something with the court? I don't know. That's what we need to find out. I called Chen immediately from the coffee shop, putting him on speaker so Hannah could hear. I need you to find Megan Reed's birth certificate, the original filing, as fast as possible. He called back 3 hours later. What he'd found made the betrayal even more comprehensive. There are 2 birth certificates on file, Chen reported. The first was filed January 15, 1995, when you were born. It lists your mother as Sarah Elizabeth Reed and your father as John Callahan. Standard registration, no issues. And the second, filed May 20, 1997, 2 months after Sarah's death. It lists your mother as Evelyn Reed and your father as Mark Reed. There's a notation, corrected information per court order, case number 97 F1-47. My vision actually tunneled. Evelyn had literally rewritten my birth certificate, legally erased Sarah as my mother and inserted herself. How is that possible? I managed to ask. In 1997, family court records weren't digitized like they are now, Chen explained. If Evelyn had the right connections, and we know she did, she could have petitioned a judge to modify the birth record. The argument would have been that listing a deceased mother, particularly one she'd characterized as unstable, was psychologically harmful to the child. Since Mark and Evelyn were raising you, the court could order the records to reflect that reality. Is it legal? If processed correctly through the courts, technically, yes. Highly irregular, but not impossible. And it means that legally on paper you're Mark and Evelyn's daughter, not Sarah's. After the call ended, I sat with Hannah for another hour, both of us too stunned to speak much. She eventually had to leave. If she stayed away too long, Evelyn would start asking questions. We exchanged phone numbers, agreed to stay in contact, and parted as something closer to allies than we'd ever been. That night, after I'd put Liam to bed, I sat alone in the dark living room and finally let myself feel the full weight of everything I'd learned. My entire identity was a fabrication. The woman I'd called mother for 30 years was actually my aunt, who'd murdered my real mother. The man I'd called father was my uncle who'd loved me but been too afraid to tell me the truth or protect me from his wife. I'd been robbed of $45 million. But more devastating than the money, I'd been robbed of Sarah, of knowing my mother, of being raised with love instead of contempt, of understanding who I really was. The sobs came from somewhere deep, a grief so profound it felt like it was tearing me apart from the inside. I cried for Sarah, who'd loved me and tried to protect me and died for it. I cried for the childhood I should have had. I cried for Mark's cowardice. I cried for 30 years of believing I was fundamentally unworthy when the truth was I'd been the legitimate heir being suppressed by a murderer. At 2 a.m, when the grief threatened to drown me completely, I called my therapist's emergency line. She listened to everything, then said quietly, "Your grief is appropriate and necessary. But Megan, you need to remember something. You survived. Despite everything Evelyn did to break you, you built a good life. You became a good mother. You maintained your integrity. That strength didn't come from Reed money or family status. It came from you. Don't let this destroy what you've built." Those words were still echoing in my mind the next morning when the certified letter arrived. I signed for it with dread already pooling in my stomach. Notice of intent to file for emergency custody of minor child Liam Reed based on mother's demonstrated mental instability and inability to provide stable environment. Hearing scheduled for 1 week from today. 1 week. Evelyn had moved the timeline up. She was coming for my son. 1 week. I had 1 week to prove I wasn't the unstable, delusional woman Evelyn was painting me to be, or I would lose Liam. Jennifer went into overdrive, immediately filing an emergency motion with the court and coordinating with Chen to arrange DNA testing that could definitively prove my parentage. "We need independent testing," Jennifer insisted. "Not affiliated with any institution where the Reed family has influence, and we need it done fast." The problem was, Sarah had been dead for 28 years. We couldn't exactly get a DNA sample from her directly. Chen worked with Margaret Thompson to retrieve Sarah's personal belongings from storage hairbrushes that might still have follicles, clothing items, anything that could yield biological material. It was a long shot, but it was what we had. And then Jennifer did something that made my stomach turn. She filed for legal authorization to exhume Mark's body. "We need to prove he was your uncle, not your father. That means comparing your DNA to his. I know it's disturbing, but it's necessary." The laboratory Jennifer found was in New York, completely outside the Reed family's network. But when we contacted them with our timeline, the geneticist was blunt. DNA extraction from hair samples and degraded biological material, plus comparison testing with exhumed remains. We're looking at 10 to 14 days minimum for conclusive results. I can't rush science. "We have 7 days until a custody hearing," Jennifer said. The geneticist was silent for a moment. "I'll do everything I can, but I can't make promises." Jennifer filed an emergency motion to delay the custody hearing until DNA results were available, arguing that the evidence was directly relevant since Evelyn's petition explicitly claimed I had delusional beliefs about my parentage. If we could prove those beliefs were factually correct, it would undermine Evelyn's entire case. The court scheduled a hearing on our motion for 3 days from now. Meanwhile, Evelyn launched a comprehensive assault on every aspect of my life. I first realized how far she was willing to go when my boss called me into his office 2 days after the custody notice arrived. "Megan, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me," he said, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Are you going through some things right now that might be affecting your work?" My blood went cold. "What are you talking about?" "I received a call from someone claiming to be a concerned family member. They suggested I should be aware that you're experiencing some mental health challenges and that it might impact your performance. They were very worried about you." Evelyn. She'd contacted my employer, planting seeds of doubt about my competence and stability. Even though my work performance had been flawless, the mere suggestion was now in my boss's mind. "I'm involved in a family legal matter," I said carefully. "My work hasn't been affected and won't be affected. If you have concerns about my performance, I'd like to hear them specifically." He didn't have any, but the damage was done. I could see him looking at me differently, questioning, wondering if there was instability beneath the surface. The next blow came from Child Protective Services. A caseworker showed up at my apartment unannounced, explaining that they'd received a report alleging I'd been observed yelling at my child and leaving him unsupervised. The report was completely fabricated. I'd never yelled at Liam, never left him alone, but CPS was obligated to investigate. The caseworker interviewed Liam, inspected our apartment, asked probing questions about my mental health and stress levels. Even though the investigation ultimately found no evidence of abuse or neglect, it created an official record. Documentation that someone had been concerned enough about my parenting to file a report. And then there was the social circle. People I'd known for years started reaching out with concerned messages. "I heard you're going through a difficult time. Evelyn mentioned you've been making some unusual claims about family history. Is everything okay? You know you can talk to me if you're struggling." Evelyn was systematically isolating me, turning my own community against me by portraying me as someone having a breakdown, making wild accusations about murders, claiming to be owed millions, threatening stable family members. It was character assassination executed with surgical precision. The worst part was Hannah. 3 days before the motion hearing, she called me, and I could hear the strain in her voice immediately. "Megan, I need to talk to you about something. Mother she's been explaining things about the documents. She says there's context I don't understand, that you've manipulated how I'm seeing everything." "Hannah." "She's my mother." Hannah interrupted, her voice breaking. "Despite everything, she raised me. She fed me, clothed me, sent me to school. How do I know which version of reality is true? How do I know you're not the one manipulating me?" I closed my eyes, fighting despair. Decades of psychological conditioning couldn't be undone in 2 weeks. Hannah was genuinely torn between the evidence she'd seen with her own eyes and the emotional bond with the only mother she'd ever known. "Hannah, I'm not asking you to testify against Evelyn or publicly denounce her," I said as calmly as I could manage. "I'm just asking you to tell the truth about what you found in that safe. Documents that exist independently of either of our interpretations. You saw them. You photographed them. Just tell the truth about what they say." "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone, understanding that without Hannah's testimony, much of my evidence was just my word against Evelyn's. The documents existed, but if Hannah wouldn't confirm where they came from, Evelyn could claim they were fabricated. 5 days before the custody hearing, my phone rang. The DNA laboratory. "Ms. Reed, we have preliminary results, but there's something unusual. We need to discuss this in person immediately." I drove to the New York laboratory the next morning, my heart pounding the entire 2-hour drive. Jennifer met me there, both of us, understanding that whatever the geneticist had found, it was significant enough to require an in-person meeting rather than a phone call. Dr. Patricia Chen, the lead geneticist, met us in a private conference room with charts and reports spread across the table. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Based on DNA extracted from Sarah Reed's personal items and compared with your sample, there is a 99.97% probability that Sarah Elizabeth Reed was your biological mother," she began. "Additionally, testing of Mark Reed's exhumed remains confirms he was your maternal uncle, not your father. These results are conclusive and will stand up to any legal scrutiny." Relief washed over me so powerfully I felt dizzy. Proof. Scientific, undeniable proof that I wasn't delusional, wasn't making wild claims, wasn't the unstable person Evelyn had spent decades claiming I was. "However, Doctor," Chen continued, "there's something else we discovered that you need to know about." She pulled up additional data on her laptop, turning the screen so we could see genetic comparison charts. "You provided us with samples from Hannah Reed's personal items for comparison purposes. We tested her DNA against both Sarah's and Mark's." Dr. Chen looked at me directly. "Hannah is not genetically related to either of them. She shares no DNA with you at all. Based on our analysis, she has no biological connection to the Reed family bloodline whatsoever." I stared at the charts, not understanding. "That's impossible. She's my sister, or I thought she was my cousin, but—" Hannah was either adopted or conceived through egg donation and surrogacy, Dr. Chen explained. Either way, she has 0 genetic markers in common with Mark or Sarah Reed. Whoever her biological parents are, they're not part of the Reed family. Everything suddenly clicked into place with devastating clarity. Evelyn's obsessive control of Hannah, the elaborate medical documentation, the way Hannah had been manufactured from birth to be the perfect heir. She wasn't just being groomed, she was literally created to replace Sarah. A child who would owe her entire existence to Evelyn, who could be completely controlled because without Evelyn, she had no identity at all. Jennifer was already on her phone, fingers flying across the screen. When she looked up, her expression was fierce with vindication. "Megan, do you understand what this means? According to the Reed Estate Trust, you are the only living biological descendant of Sarah Reed. Hannah has no legal claim to the inheritance at all. Sarah's 60% plus Mark's 40%, since he had no biological children, belongs entirely to you. We're talking about approximately $75 million. $75 million. The entire estate. All of it legally mine, and Evelyn had been illegally controlling it for 28 years. We need to move fast," Jennifer continued. "I'm filing an emergency motion to freeze all Reed Estate assets pending resolution of the inheritance dispute. And I'm submitting these DNA results to the court with our response to Evelyn's custody petition. Her entire case is built on the claim that you have delusional beliefs about your parentage. We just proved scientifically that every claim you've made is true." Within hours, Evelyn's attorneys were served with the motion and the DNA results. I wasn't there when they told her, but Chen's surveillance equipment picked up what happened next. Evelyn called an emergency meeting with Hannah and Kyle at the Reed mansion. Chen had managed to plant audio devices in the house during an earlier investigation, and what we heard was chilling. Evelyn didn't panic. She didn't break down. She became coldly, terrifyingly calculating. "You are not a Reed by blood," she told Hannah, her voice like ice. "I created you. I molded you. I gave you everything you are. Without me, you are nothing. You have no claim to any of this, do you understand? Nothing." Through the recording, I could hear Hannah sobbing. "The only way you maintain any position in this family is if we destroy Megan's credibility so completely that no court will believe her evidence," Evelyn continued. "You're going to testify that she's been unstable for years, that she manipulated you, that she forced you to help fabricate evidence, that the documents from my safe were forged. Mother, I can't." "You can and you will, unless you want to lose everything." There was a long pause, then Kyle's voice. "I think I need to speak with my own attorney." "What?" "Hannah, I married you because you were a Reed heir. If you're not actually a Reed, if there's no inheritance, then we need to discuss our options." The recording captured Hannah's breakdown, Evelyn's cold fury, and Kyle's pragmatic calculation. The perfect family was fracturing in real time, and Evelyn was preparing for war. That night at 3 a.m, the fire alarm in my building went off. Liam and I stumbled out into the cold in our pajamas along with all the other residents. The fire department arrived, quickly searched the building, and determined it was a false alarm. But the fire chief pulled me aside afterward, his expression grave. "Ms. Reed, we found evidence that someone tampered with the gas lines in the basement. Looks like an attempt to cause an explosion that would appear accidental. We're calling the police." I looked down at Liam, shivering in the December cold, and understood completely. Evelyn was done playing by rules. The police investigation into the attempted arson gave us exactly what we needed: documented evidence that Evelyn was willing to commit violence to protect her secrets. Jennifer used it to accelerate our timeline, arguing that waiting put both Liam and me in immediate physical danger. Within 48 hours, we launched a coordinated legal assault on 3 fronts simultaneously. First, Jennifer filed a civil lawsuit against Evelyn for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conversion of assets. The complaint was brutally specific. Evelyn had murdered Sarah Reed and John Callahan in 1997 to steal control of the Reed estate, then spent 28 years illegally managing assets that belonged to me. We sought return of the full $75 million estate, plus punitive damages for the decades of psychological abuse and fraud. Second, we submitted a comprehensive evidence package to the district attorney requesting criminal investigation of Sarah's and John's deaths as homicides. The package included Carlos Rodriguez's testimony about the tampered brakes financial records showing Evelyn's $50,000 cash withdrawal days before Sarah's death, the $25,000 payment to John Callahan, and most damning, Evelyn's own handwritten note. She will never give up her inheritance voluntarily. Other measures necessary. Third, we filed for emergency dissolution of Evelyn's role as estate manager and requested appointment of an independent trustee to prevent further asset dissipation. The courthouse filings became public record at 9 a.m. By noon, my phone was ringing nonstop with calls from reporters. By 3 news vans were parked outside my apartment building. The headline on the Boston Globe website made my hands shake. Boston heiress accused of 28-year-old double murder to steal $75 million fortune. What had been a private family dispute had exploded into a very public scandal. I couldn't leave my building without cameras in my face. Reporters shouted questions. "Ms. Reed, do you really believe your aunt killed your mother? Is this about justice or money? How does it feel to accuse the woman who raised you?" But Evelyn had spent decades building relationships with media and public relations professionals. Her counteroffensive was swift and sophisticated. By evening, a different narrative was spreading through friendly media outlets and social media. A statement from the Reed family painted me as a troubled woman making fantastic accusations to justify a money grab. Several articles described Evelyn as a longtime philanthropist and pillar of Boston society who'd generously raised her troubled niece for nearly 3 decades, only to be repaid with baseless allegations. The PR campaign was masterful. They didn't directly attack me that would seem cruel. Instead, they expressed concern, sadness, bewilderment that someone they'd loved and supported could turn on them this way. Witnesses from the Christmas dinner were produced giving interviews about how I'd seemed paranoid and unstable, how I'd brought lawyers to a family celebration, how I'd made everyone uncomfortable with my accusations. Then Evelyn herself appeared on local news, and I had to admit, she was good. Sitting in the Reed Mansion library surrounded by photos of me as a child, she gave a tearful interview that was perfectly calibrated to generate sympathy. "I love Megan as my own daughter," she said, dabbing at her eyes. "I'm heartbroken that she's been influenced by people who see dollar signs and have convinced her to destroy her own family. If she's truly ill, struggling with delusions or paranoia, I want to help her get treatment, not punish her." The comment sections exploded with debate. Some people found my evidence compelling: the DNA results, the financial records, the mechanic's testimony. Others dismissed me as a gold digger who'd fabricated an elaborate story to steal money from the woman who'd raised me. The public was split, and that division was exactly what Evelyn wanted. Reasonable doubt. Ambiguity. Just enough confusion to make people question whether this was really about justice or just greed. But the real battle wasn't in the court of public opinion. It was in the actual courtroom, and the pivotal figure there was Hannah. She was the only person besides Evelyn who could testify about what was in that safe. The documents proving Sarah and I were mentally sound. The surveillance reports on Sarah. The handwritten note planning other measures. The fake psychiatric evaluations Hannah had received for 18 years. Without Hannah's testimony confirming those documents existed and where they came from, much of our case became my word against Evelyn's. Evelyn understood this and applied overwhelming pressure. I heard through Margaret Thompson that Evelyn was spending hours with Hannah every day, deploying every manipulation tactic she'd perfected over 33 years. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me. If you testify against me, you'll have nothing, no family, no inheritance, no identity. They're using you, Hannah. They don't care about you." Kyle's law firm sent Hannah a letter threatening to sue her for defamation if she made any public accusations against Evelyn. The message was clear: supporting me would cost Hannah everything. But I reached out too, not with threats or pressure, but with understanding. "I know this is impossible for you," I told her during a brief phone call. "You're learning your entire life was constructed on lies. But Hannah, you have a choice now that neither of us had before, the choice to tell the truth and start building something real. I'm not asking you to do this for me. I'm asking you to do it for yourself so you can finally know who you are outside of Evelyn's control." The day before Hannah's scheduled deposition, she disappeared. Checked into a hotel under a false name, turned off her phone, vanished. None of us knew which version of Hannah would show up: Evelyn's loyal daughter or someone ready to tell the truth. The deposition was scheduled for 10 in the morning. Both legal teams arrived early, taking positions on opposite sides of the conference room table like armies preparing for battle. The court reporter set up her equipment. We waited. At exactly 10, Hannah walked in. She looked exhausted, but oddly calm. She sat down in the witness chair, placed her hands flat on the table, took a deep breath, and looked directly at Evelyn. "Everything I'm about to say is the truth." Hannah's deposition lasted 4 hours. 4 hours during which she systematically dismantled every defense Evelyn had constructed over 28 years. I watched from the other side of the table as Hannah described finding the safe combination after Mark's death, opening it out of curiosity, discovering documents that made no sense until she started researching. There were psychological evaluations of Sarah Reed stating she was mentally sound and competent. Hannah testified, her voice steady despite visible tears, directly contradicting everything Mother had told me about Sarah being unstable. There were surveillance reports from private investigators monitoring Sarah's daily activities in 1996 and 1997. And there was a handwritten note in Mother's handwriting dated 5 days before Sarah's death, saying, "She will never give up her inheritance voluntarily. Other measures necessary." She described the financial records: the $50,000 payment to Rodriguez Auto Service, the $25,000 payment to John Callahan. She explained how she'd searched those names and found obituaries, death certificates, police reports about brake failures. But the most powerful part of her testimony wasn't about Sarah. It was about herself. "My mother, Evelyn Reed, controlled every aspect of my life from birth," Hannah said, and her voice finally broke. "I now know I'm not biologically related to her or Mark Reed, which explains why she always treated me as a project rather than a daughter. She medicated me unnecessarily for 18 years to create a paper trail of mental health issues. She arranged my marriage to Kyle Mitchell for business connections. She scripted my social media presence to maintain the family image." Hannah looked directly at Evelyn, who sat frozen, her face a mask of rage barely contained. "And when I started questioning her, she told me explicitly that I was nothing without her, that my entire existence was her creation, that she could destroy me as easily as she built me." Hannah's voice strengthened. "I believe my mother is capable of murder. I've seen how she eliminates anything that threatens her control, and I won't be her accomplice anymore." The testimony made immediate headlines, but while the public consumed Hannah's dramatic revelations, my forensic accountants were presenting findings that transformed the case from family drama into criminal enterprise. Over 28 years, Evelyn had systematically looted approximately $40 million from the Reed estate through elaborate schemes. Inflated management fees that went to shell companies she controlled, payments for services never rendered, personal expenses, her home renovations, her cars, her country club memberships disguised as estate costs. High-risk investments that conveniently failed with the losses potentially redirected to offshore accounts the accountants were still trying to trace. She'd been careful, leaving just enough assets intact to avoid triggering audit requirements. But the estate that should have been worth $75 million was now worth only $35 million in documented accessible assets. Another $30 million had vanished into a labyrinth of financial maneuvers. The Massachusetts Attorney General's office announced a formal criminal investigation into embezzlement, racketeering, and tax fraud. Evelyn was cornered. Everywhere she turned, evidence closed in. And that's when she made her most calculated move yet. Her attorney contacted Jennifer with an unusual request. Evelyn wanted a private meeting with me. No lawyers, just the two of us. She wanted to finally tell the truth and seek forgiveness. Absolutely not, Jennifer said immediately. It's a trap. But I needed to hear what Evelyn would say when she thought no one was listening. I agreed to the meeting wearing a concealed recording device legally under Massachusetts single-party consent laws. We met in a neutral location, a private room at a hotel neither of us had connections to. Evelyn arrived looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, her usual commanding presence diminished. She sat across from me, and for a long moment we just looked at each other. "You want to know what happened to Sarah?" she said finally. "Yes. I had her killed." The confession came out almost casually, like she was discussing a business transaction. She was going to take everything. Mark's love, the Reed fortune, the social position I'd worked for. I paid someone to tamper with her brakes. Made it look like an accident. She paused. And yes, I eliminated that graduate student she was sleeping with. He could have claimed paternity complicated the inheritance. I couldn't allow that. I sat frozen, barely breathing, as she continued. "I've lived with this for 28 years, Megan. It's eaten at me every day." But then her expression changed. The remorse disappeared, replaced by something calculating and cold. "And now you have my confession. On recording, I assume." She smiled slightly. "But here's what happens next. I'm 66 years old. Even if convicted, I'll likely die in prison before serving a full sentence. Hannah will be destroyed publicly. And you, Megan. You'll get your money. But Liam will grow up knowing his grandmother is a murderer, that his family history is built on violence and lies." She leaned forward, her eyes locked on mine. "Or you could take a settlement. $50 million. Full control of the estate. And I live out my remaining years quietly. No trials, no publicity, no destroying everyone in the blast radius." She gave me exactly what she knew would hurt most. "You have 24 hours to decide justice or mercy. But remember, if you choose justice, Liam loses his innocence forever. Can you live with that?" I left that hotel room with Evelyn's confession recorded on the device hidden in my jacket, her ultimatum echoing in my mind. 24 hours to choose between $50 million and justice, between protecting Liam's innocence and honoring Sarah's memory. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I met with Jennifer, my therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, and Margaret Thompson in Jennifer's office. I played them the recording, watched their faces as they heard Evelyn casually admit to double murder and then offer me money to stay silent. $50 million would secure Liam's future, Jennifer said, playing devil's advocate. No more financial stress, no more worrying about college or stability, and you'd avoid years of brutal public trials. But at what cost? Dr. Kim asked quietly. Margaret spoke the truth I needed to hear, her voice firm despite her age. "I stayed silent for 28 years because Mark convinced me it was protecting you. That silence allowed Evelyn to hurt you, to hurt Hannah, to live freely after murdering Sarah. If you accept this deal, what are you teaching Liam? That powerful people can commit horrific crimes and buy their way out. That truth is negotiable. That money is more important than integrity." She reached across the table and took my hand. "Or are you teaching him that justice is worth fighting for, even when it's hard? That some things, truth, dignity, the memory of the dead, aren't for sale at any price?" I made my decision then. The next morning, I submitted Evelyn's recorded confession to the district attorney and released a public statement through Jennifer's office. I was offered money to stay silent about my mother's murder. I refused. Some things aren't for sale, truth, justice, and my son's understanding of right and wrong. Evelyn Reed killed my mother and father, stole my inheritance, and psychologically tortured multiple people for 3 decades. She will face the full consequences under the law. The media explosion was immediate and overwhelming, but this time the narrative had shifted. I wasn't the unstable woman making wild accusations. I was the daughter seeking justice for her murdered mother. Armed with Hannah's testimony, Evelyn's recorded confession, Carlos Rodriguez's evidence about the tampered brakes, the financial records and forensic analysis of the 1997 accidents, the Massachusetts Attorney General filed criminal charges, 2 counts of first-degree murder, embezzlement, fraud, racketeering, and multiple counts of child endangerment for the unnecessary medication of Hannah. Evelyn's attorneys tried every defense they could manufacture. They argued the confession was coerced, but the recording clearly showed me sitting calmly, never threatening her, never forcing anything. They claimed she had diminished capacity due to age, but court-ordered medical examinations proved she was fully competent and understood exactly what she'd done. They tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor refused to offer anything less than substantial prison time. The case went to trial in late spring, and it became the kind of media sensation that dominated every news cycle. Wealthy Boston matriarch accused of decades-old double murder to steal a fortune. The courtroom was packed every single day, people lining up hours early to get seats. Public opinion, which had been divided when I first filed charges, was now firmly against Evelyn as witness after witness built an inescapable wall of evidence. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Hannah testified again, this time publicly describing her life as Evelyn's manufactured creation. Carlos Rodriguez explained the mechanical impossibility of both cars failing naturally within weeks of each other. Forensic accountants detailed the systematic theft of $40 million. The prosecutor played Evelyn's recorded confession, her voice filling the courtroom. Yes, I had her killed. But the most powerful moment came when I took the stand. The prosecutor didn't ask me about financial records or mechanical evidence. Instead, she asked me to talk about what Evelyn had stolen that couldn't be measured in dollars. Evelyn Reed didn't just kill my mother. I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. She killed the possibility of who I could have been if I'd been raised with love instead of contempt. She stole my identity, my history, my family. She made me believe I was worthless for 30 years. She attempted to do the same thing to my son, and she destroyed Hannah's ability to become an authentic person. I pulled out Sarah's diary, the one Margaret had preserved for me, and read an entry from 2 weeks before her death. If anything happens to me, I hope Megan grows up knowing she was deeply loved and wanted. I hope she becomes someone brave and kind, someone who stands up for what's right even when it's difficult. I hope she never lets anyone make her feel less than she is. My voice broke on the last sentence, but I forced myself to continue looking directly at the jury. I am the person my mother hoped I would be, despite everything Evelyn did to prevent it. That's my victory. I'm here asking you to give my mother the justice she deserves and to ensure Evelyn can never hurt anyone else. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 2 days. 2 days during which I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could barely function. Liam stayed with Margaret, protected from the media circus, while I waited. Finally, the call came. The jury had reached a verdict. I walked into the courtroom feeling like I was moving through water, everything slow and surreal. Jennifer sat beside me, her hand briefly squeezing mine as we took our seats. Across the aisle, Evelyn sat with her defense team, her posture perfect as always, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the table's edge. The jury filed in. I tried to read their faces, searching for some hint of what they'd decided, but they looked straight ahead, professionally neutral. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict. The forewoman stood. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Sarah Elizabeth Reed, how do you find guilty? The word hit me like a physical force. Around me, the courtroom erupted gasps, someone sobbing, reporters frantically typing. But I sat frozen, barely breathing. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of John Callahan, how do you find guilty? They continued through the remaining charges. Guilty of embezzlement. Guilty of fraud. Guilty of child endangerment. Every single count. I looked at Evelyn. She sat completely still initially, her face an unreadable mask. But as the judge began to speak about sentencing, something in her composure finally cracked. Her shoulders sagged slightly. Her hands released their death grip on the table. The judge's voice was cold and unsparing. Mrs. Reed, you committed calculated, premeditated murder of 2 young people to satisfy your greed and lust for control. You then spent 28 years stealing from your victim's daughter, psychologically tormenting her, and attempting to repeat your pattern of destruction with the next generation. These crimes demonstrate a profound lack of moral character and an ongoing danger to society. He pronounced sentence 2 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole for the murders, plus 25 additional years for the financial crimes and child endangerment to run concurrently. Evelyn would die in prison. There would be no early release, no parole hearings, no second chances. As the bailiffs moved to take her into custody, Evelyn looked at me one final time, and what I saw in her expression wasn't hatred or defiance. It was something closer to respect, maybe even admiration. She mouthed silently so only I could see, "You won." Then she was led away in handcuffs, and an era ended. In the weeks following the verdict, I learned that victory had costs I hadn't anticipated. Justice was served, yes, but it left casualties in its wake. Hannah checked herself into a long-term residential therapy program, completely shattered by the revelations about her life. 33 years of psychological manipulation couldn't be processed in a few therapy sessions. She needed intensive help to rebuild an identity from scratch, to figure out who she was when she wasn't performing a role Evelyn had written for her. Kyle filed for divorce. Not cruelly, he actually seemed almost apologetic about it. But their entire relationship had been built on false pretenses. Hannah needed space to discover herself before she could be in any genuine partnership, and Kyle needed to move on with his life. Hannah and I began a tentative relationship, talking once a week, meeting occasionally for coffee. But we weren't sisters in any meaningful sense, more like friendly acquaintances who shared trauma. The damage was too deep to heal quickly if it could ever fully heal at all. The Reed family social circle fractured completely. Some people apologized to me, shamefaced, admitting they should have questioned Evelyn's narrative years ago. Others simply faded away, too embarrassed or too complicit to face me. I lost friendships with people who'd believed Evelyn's characterization of me and never bothered to apologize even after the truth came out. Most painfully, Liam struggled. At 7 years old, he understood that his grandmother had killed people. That much of what he'd known about our family was lies. I found him a child therapist who specialized in trauma, and we worked through age-appropriate explanations together. But I could see something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a wariness, a loss of innocence that broke my heart. The financial resolution was complicated. The estate entered probate with me as the sole legitimate heir. But after legal fees, accounting costs, and restitution to various victims of Evelyn's fraud, I received approximately $32 million. Substantial, yes. Life-changing, certainly. But far less than the $75 million that should have been there. The missing $40 million had vanished into Evelyn's schemes, spent on her lifestyle, hidden in offshore accounts we might never trace, or genuinely lost to bad investments. Part of me wanted to keep fighting to hunt down every missing dollar, but I made peace with it instead. It was never about the money, I told Jennifer. It was about truth and justice for my mother. I established the Sarah Reed Foundation, using a portion of the funds for causes my mother had cared about, based on what Margaret and her journals told me. Education access for underprivileged students, support for single mothers, funding for domestic violence prevention programs. I kept my job in tech. I didn't need the salary anymore, but I needed the normalcy, the identity that came from work I'd earned myself rather than inherited. I moved us into a larger home, not a mansion, but a comfortable place where Liam had space to grow and heal. And most importantly, I filled it with photographs of Sarah telling Liam stories about the grandmother he'd never met. "Your grandmother Sarah was brave and kind," I told him. "She loved you before you were born through loving me. And everything good I do is honoring her memory." 6 months after the trial, a letter arrived from Switzerland. The return address was an attorney's office I didn't recognize. I opened it carefully, wondering what new revelation could possibly emerge now. "Dear Ms. Reed, regarding the estate of your biological father, John Callahan." I read the letter from Switzerland 3 times before I could fully process what it meant. John Callahan, my biological father, had left a trust for any children he might have fathered. The Swiss attorney handling the final dissolution of his estate had discovered Sarah's pregnancy records and my original birth certificate, the one Evelyn had tried to erase. The trust contained $500,000. Not life-changing money for me now, but the symbolism was overwhelming. My father had thought about me, planned for me, tried to provide for me, even though he never got the chance to meet me. But more valuable than the money was what arrived in a separate package: John's personal effects. Photographs of a young man with kind eyes and an easy smile standing in hiking boots on mountain trails holding beakers in a university lab. His graduate thesis on environmental conservation filled with passionate arguments about protecting ecosystems for future generations. Letters he'd written to Sarah that she'd apparently kept in a safety deposit box the attorney had finally accessed. "My darling Sarah, I can't wait to meet our daughter. Every time I think about being a father, I feel terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. I hope she has your courage and your laugh." And most devastating, a journal entry from March 1997, just 3 days before his death. "Sarah is afraid of her sister-in-law Evelyn. She says E watches her with hatred, like she's planning something. I told S she's probably being paranoid, but honestly there's something off about that woman. I've started documenting our conversations just in case. If anything happens to S, someone needs to know Evelyn is dangerous." He'd known. He'd sensed the threat, but neither of them had acted quickly enough, and they'd both paid with their lives. 2 months later, I visited Hannah at the residential facility. She looked different, lighter somehow, despite the obvious strain on her face. Her hair was cut shorter, styled casually instead of the perfect waves she'd always maintained. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, no designer labels visible. "I'm learning to make basic decisions," she told me over coffee in the facility's garden. "What I actually like to eat, what music I prefer, what I think about politics. Everything was scripted before by Evelyn. It's terrifying and liberating at the same time." She'd made a major decision, changing her legal name to Hannah Miller, taking her biological mother's surname. Records had revealed that Evelyn adopted her as an infant from a woman named Catherine Miller. "I don't want to be a Reed anymore," Hannah said quietly. "That name is tied to too much pain. I need to build something genuinely mine." She was also donating her settlement from Evelyn's estate forfeiture, approximately $3 million, to organizations supporting adoption rights and psychological abuse survivors. We talked for 2 hours, and I understood that we might never have a traditional sisterly relationship. The damage was too deep, and Hannah needed distance from anything connected to the Reed legacy. But we could be something else, 2 people who'd survived the same monster and could offer each other a unique kind of understanding. My own healing was messier, more complicated. In therapy with Dr. Kim, I processed emotions that contradicted each other constantly. Relief that Evelyn would never hurt anyone again. Grief for 30 years lost. Anger at Mark's cowardice. Pride in fighting back. Guilt about what this had cost Liam and Hannah. "Healing isn't linear," Dr. Kim reminded me. "You'll have strong days and broken days. Both are valid. The goal is integrating this truth into your identity while building a life defined by more than trauma." I started writing a memoir, not for publication, but for Liam. When he was older, he'd read my words explaining the complexity. "Your grandmother Evelyn did terrible things, but that doesn't make you terrible. You get to choose which legacy you carry forward." 1 year after Evelyn's conviction, on what would have been Sarah's 55th birthday, my doorbell rang. An elderly woman stood there, her hands clasped nervously. "Ms. Reed." "My name is Catherine Miller. I'm Hannah's biological mother. May I come in?" I invited Catherine Miller into my home, studying her as she settled nervously on my couch. She was in her mid-50s, dressed simply, her hands trembling slightly as she accepted the tea I offered. "I've been following the trial," she began. "Every day, every detail. And when I saw Hannah's testimony, saw what Evelyn did to her, what she did to you," her voice broke. "I've been sick with guilt for a year, trying to decide if I had any right to reach out." She told me her story. In 1992, she'd been 22 years old, working as a waitress, struggling to survive as a single mother. Evelyn had approached her through a private adoption agency offering what seemed like salvation $100,000 for a closed adoption. She told me my baby would have the best life possible, private schools opportunities I could never provide. I signed papers, agreeing never to contact her, never to interfere. I thought I was giving her a better future. Catherine wiped her eyes. But I gave my daughter to a monster, and I've had to live with that for 33 years. She had no interest in disrupting Hannah's life or claiming maternal rights. She just wanted to know, is Hannah okay? Is she healing? I called Hannah's therapist, and together we arranged a carefully managed meeting at the facility. I drove Catherine there, both of us silent with anxiety about what would happen. The reunion wasn't magical. Hannah was angry, furious that she'd been given away, that her entire existence had been a transaction. Catherine was defensive about impossible choices made when she was barely more than a child herself. They both cried. They both said things that hurt, but it was honest. And by the end, they'd agreed to try to build something real, even if it was messy and complicated and nothing like a normal mother-daughter relationship. Meanwhile, I was building my own new chapter, making conscious choices about who I wanted to be now that the battle was over. I accepted a promotion at work, becoming Director of Solutions Architecture. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to be publicly successful without fear of punishment. I started dating, cautiously aware that 30 years of Reed trauma had affected my ability to trust, but believing I deserved love anyway. I enrolled Liam in an excellent private school funded by the Sarah Reed Foundation. Not to show off wealth, but to give him opportunities while teaching him humility and the value of work. And most importantly, I established a ritual every month. Liam and I visit Sarah's grave together. I tell him stories about the grandmother whose love he carries in his DNA, even though he never met her. And I talk to Sarah knowing she can't hear me, but needing to say the words anyway. I hope I made you proud, Mom. I fought for you, for me, for Liam. We won. Not perfectly, not without cost, but we won. The healing isn't linear or easy. I still have days when the weight of what was stolen from me feels crushing. Days when I can't get out of bed, when the grief ambushes me in grocery stores or at traffic lights. Liam still has nightmares, still asks questions that break my heart. Why was Great-Grandma Evelyn so mean? Why did Great-Uncle Mark lie? Hannah calls sometimes in crisis when the work of rebuilding her identity feels impossible. I don't know who I am, she sobs. I don't know if I'll ever know. But we're moving forward, all of us, building authentic lives instead of performing scripted roles. The Reed empire has collapsed completely. The mansion was sold to pay legal debts. The social circle that enabled Evelyn through silence has scattered. The family name is now synonymous with scandal rather than prestige. But from those ashes, we're building something better. 6 months after Catherine's first visit, the four of us, Megan, Liam, Hannah, and Catherine, share a quiet Sunday dinner at my home. It's not a grand celebration, just simple food, honest conversation, and the tentative beginnings of something real. Liam looks around this table and asks, "Are we a family now?" I consider the question carefully before answering. We're becoming one. The kind built on choice and truth. It won't be perfect, but it will be real. December came around again, bringing with it the familiar chill and the scent of pine and the twinkling lights that had once filled me with dread. But standing in my new home, not the cramped apartment from a year ago, not a Reed family mansion, but a comfortable house that genuinely felt like mine, I realized something had fundamentally changed. I wasn't afraid of Christmas anymore. Liam, now 8 years old, and noticeably more mature after everything we'd been through, was helping me decorate the tree. Not a small discount artificial tree this time, but a real one we'd picked out together at a local farm, driving out on a cold Saturday, and choosing one that was slightly crooked, but perfect for us. My hands were steady as I hung ornaments. No trembling. No suppressed memories of standing in corners while Hannah received mountains of gifts. No dread about upcoming family obligations designed to remind me of my place in the hierarchy. This tree wasn't professionally coordinated or magazine-worthy, Some ornaments were handmade by Liam in art class lopsided stars and painted pine cones. Others were ones I'd collected over the years, each with a story. It wasn't perfect, but it was filled with genuine warmth and joy in a way the Reed family's elaborate displays had never been. Liam held up an ornament he'd made in therapy, a carefully drawn picture of 3 people, him, me, and Sarah, based on the photographs he now knew by heart. "I made one for Grandma Sarah," he said, hanging it on a prominent branch. "So she's part of our Christmas, even though she can't be here." My eyes filled with tears, but they were the healing kind, the kind that come from gratitude and love rather than pain. "She would love that, sweetheart. Thank you." Later that evening, people began arriving for dinner. Not the dreaded obligation to attend Hannah's performative event, but people I'd chosen to invite. People who genuinely loved us. Margaret Thompson arrived first, now in her 80s, but still sharp and fierce, bringing her famous apple pie and hugging me tightly. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. Robert Chen and Jennifer Walsh came together, having become friends during the investigation. They brought wine and stories about their latest cases, treating me like a colleague and friend rather than a client. Several co-workers from my tech company arrived, people who'd supported me through the difficult year without judgment or gossip. And then Hannah arrived with Catherine. Hannah looked different than she had at our first Sunday dinner months ago, more relaxed, more present. She was still fragile, still healing, but there was something genuine in her smile now. Catherine stayed close to her, their relationship tentative but growing. We gathered around my dining table for a potluck meal. No catering, no professional presentation, no assigned seating based on social hierarchy. Just food people had made and brought to share, served on mismatched dishes, eaten with laughter and honest conversation. Liam sat surrounded by adults who actually saw him, who asked him real questions about school and his interests, who valued him not because of bloodline or inheritance, but because he was a good kid and they cared about him and his mother. This was what family was supposed to feel like. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Margaret pulled me aside near the door, her aged hand warm on my arm. "Your mother Sarah would be so proud of you," she said quietly. "Not just for bringing Evelyn to justice, but for how you chose to move forward afterward. You could have become bitter, could have let rage consume you, could have taught Liam that the world is cruel and trust is impossible." She smiled at me, her eyes bright. "Instead, you showed him that truth matters, that justice is worth fighting for, and that healing is possible even after profound betrayal. That's the real victory, Megan." After everyone left and Liam was in bed, I stood at the window looking out at snow falling softly over our neighborhood. Behind me, the Christmas tree lights glowed warmly, their reflection visible in the glass, creating a double image. I thought about everything I'd learned this year. Family isn't who shares your blood or your last name. It's who shows up when things are hard. Who tells you the truth even when it's difficult. Who fights beside you and celebrates with you and holds space for your grief. Evelyn and I had shared a home for 30 years, but we were never family. Margaret Jennifer. Robert Hannah. Now even Catherine. They were more family to me than Evelyn had ever been. I'd tucked Liam in an hour earlier and he'd asked me the question that still sometimes kept him up at night. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" I'd answered with honest confidence, not false reassurance. "We already are, sweetheart. We already are." Now standing at the window, I looked at my reflection. I saw a woman transformed, no longer the scared, uncertain person who'd decorated that small tree in the apartment a year ago, believing she was fundamentally unworthy of love. Now I saw someone who knew her worth, who'd fought for justice, and one who'd built something real from the ashes of inherited trauma. I whispered to the glass, to my reflection, to Sarah's memory, wherever it existed, "The war is over. We're home now, and we're finally free." The Christmas tree lights glowed behind me, reflecting in the window, creating an image where past pain and present peace coexisted. The trauma would always be part of my story, but it no longer defined me. The story didn't end with perfect happiness. It ended with something better: earned wisdom, honest relationships, and the quiet confidence of someone who'd survived the worst and chosen to build something better. We were going to be okay. We already were. And that's where our story ends tonight. Megan Reed started as a woman who believed she was fundamentally unworthy of love, standing in a small apartment decorating a modest Christmas tree while carrying 3 decades of shame and self-doubt. She ended as someone who knew her true worth, who'd exposed a murderer, reclaimed her stolen inheritance, and most importantly broke a cycle of abuse that could have destroyed her son the same way it nearly destroyed her. But here's what I want you to really understand about this story, because it's not just about revenge or justice or even about $75 million. It's about something much more profound that every single one of us can learn from, regardless of whether we've experienced this level of family trauma. Megan's greatest victory wasn't putting Evelyn in prison. It wasn't recovering the Reed estate or proving she was Sarah's daughter. Her greatest victory was teaching Liam something that no one ever taught her: that your worth as a human being isn't determined by how others treat you. That love is a choice and an action, not an obligation that comes automatically with blood relation. That family means the people who show up for you, who tell you the truth, who fight beside you when everything falls apart. Think about the people sitting around Megan's table at that final Christmas dinner. Margaret Thompson, who'd carried guilt for 28 years, but finally found the courage to help. Robert Chen and Jennifer Walsh, who started as hired professionals but became genuine friends. Hannah, who'd spent 33 years as a puppet but chose authenticity over comfort. Catherine Miller, who made an impossible choice at 22 and spent 3 decades living with the consequences. None of them were related by blood, but they were more family to Megan than the people who raised her. That's the lesson I hope you take from this story. Real family isn't about genetics or inheritance, or maintaining appearances for social status. Real family is built on truth, respect, and the daily choice to love someone even when it's difficult. It's about creating safe spaces where children can grow up knowing they're worthy exactly as they are, not performing roles to earn conditional affection. And here's the other crucial truth. Megan's story teaches us silence never protects anyone, protects. For 28 years, Mark stayed silent because he thought it would keep Megan safe. Margaret stayed silent for the same reason. But that silence didn't protect Megan. It just gave Evelyn 3 decades to continue hurting people. The real protection, the real safety came when Megan finally spoke the truth out loud, when she refused to accept the corrupt bargain Evelyn offered, when she chose justice over comfort. We live in a world where we're often taught to stay quiet about family dysfunction, to keep secrets, to avoid embarrassment, to accept abuse, because confronting it might be messy or uncomfortable. Megan's story reminds us that the mess and discomfort of truth is always better than the false peace of silence built on lies. Now I want to hear from you, because every person watching this has their own relationship with family, their own understanding of what that word means. Have you ever had to redefine family for yourself? Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for what's right? What would you have done in Megan's position when Evelyn offered her $50 million to stay silent? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about family in a different way, or if you found yourself inspired by Megan's courage, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We tell stories like this every week, stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary strength, about truth, winning over lies, even when it takes decades, about the human capacity to heal and rebuild after profound betrayal. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe someone who's struggling with difficult family dynamics. Maybe someone who's questioning whether they deserve better treatment. Maybe someone who just needs to be reminded that choosing truth over comfort is always the right decision, even when it's the hardest one. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to Megan's story. And remember, the family you choose is just as real, just as valid, and often more loving than the family you were born into. We'll see you in the next story.